This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Right, welcome to the Environment Committee for February 2024. I'd like to welcome everybody here who's in the chamber and also those people who are tuning in from home. Members of the public may like to follow us at London Assembly on X and use the hashtag at Assembly Environment for this meeting. Can I just remind everybody, if you have got a smartphone, to switch it to silent mode, and if you put it on vibrate, and so that it's not going to receive we're not going to hear your beautiful tunes playing. Can you not put it in front of the microphone, because the microphone will still pick up any vibrations? And also, could I just mention, if you need to move the microphone around so that you can be heard properly, can you pick it up by the base? Because if you pick it up by its neck, you might break it, and we'd rather you didn't. Before we begin, we've got one or two items of business to get through, and the first one is, and thank you very much for finding my lost glasses, I'd like to ask our committee officer, Jack, to confirm if we've received any apologies for today's meeting.
Thank you, Chair. We've got no apologies for absence.
The next item on the agenda is declarations of interest. The current declarations are set out on pages 1 to 4. Can I just ask the committee to note the declarations as listed?
Noted.
And can I just ask if anyone's got any other interests that they need to declare? Okay. Item number 3 is minutes of the previous meetings. We've got 2 sets of minutes to approve: 20th of December 2023, 11th of January 2024. Is everyone happy for me to sign those as a correct record?
Agreed.
Thank you. Summary list of actions, that's still quite long, on pages 91 to 124. Can I ask you to note the completed actions and the ongoing actions arising from our previous meetings, and the additional correspondence which has been sent and received? Thank you very much. Which brings us on, and actually I'm just going to go through what the correspondence is. We sent in a response to the Ofgem consultation on energy standing charges. Thank you to everyone for your contributions to that. And we've also launched our report on community energy. And I went to a meeting of the Community Energy London group, and it was received very warmly by them. So thank you all for your contributions on that. Which brings us on to the main item on today's agenda, which is going to take up most of the meeting, which is our discussion about food security and sustainability. And I'm just going to introduce our guests, and we will be coming to them to answer some of our questions very shortly. Firstly, I'm going to start with Mark Ainsbury, who is the Food Policy Manager here at the Greater London Authority. You're very welcome, Mark. Thank you for joining us. Claire Pritchard, who is the Chair of the London Food Board. Nick von Westenholtz, who is the Director of Trade and Business Strategy at the National Farmers Union of England and Wales. We are very privileged to be joined by Sheila Dillon, who is a journalist and presents the Radio 4 The Food Programme. We've also got Sarah Williams, who is the Programme Director at Sustain. You're very welcome, Sarah, again. And finally, last but not least, we've also been joined by Brian Kelly from OrganicLea. And Brian, I think we've heard from you before, and we're very pleased to have you back with us again today. So we're going to start, as is traditional, with some questions from me, and I'm going to start by asking this to everybody, and let's see who gets their hand up first. What does a resilient food system look like for London, and how far away is that from where we are today? Or shall I just pick on Claire Pritchard? Because she just looks as though she's poised and wants to come in there.
Yeah, so I've made some notes for it, and I guess it's a very complex and broad issue when we think about who's responsible for the food supply in Britain. And I don't know if people are aware of the Anytown work that we did when we were concerned about a no-deal Brexit. And one of the questions that was asked by a fantastic person who led it was, who's legally responsible for Britain's food supply? Turns out there's no one responsible unless you're in prison or in hospital in receipt of free school meals. It's a completely free market with no one with any legal responsibility. So when they modelled around IT or water or any other things, there is someone legally responsible for the supply. But in the case of food, there isn't. So With COVID, we had the Civil Contingency Act, which meant that government ensured that food was bought and distributed to people that were being shielded. But it's the only time it's been enacted, as far as I understand, since the Second World War. So when we talk about a resilient food city, ideally we'd have some legal responsibilities and requirements that ensure that people can be fed. But we have a free market, and if you ever got the chance to talk to Carolyn Steele, she'd talk about the fact that we have a deep river compared to Paris, and that's why, because we've always been able to get food. But thinking about the reports we've read and considering there's two thoughts. There's one is, and Tim Lang will be saying this, and he'll be talking about this when he publishes later, is when we don't have a resilient system, when we have a vulnerable system like we saw during COVID, or like we're seeing now when people are increasingly experiencing poverty, it's the most vulnerable that are the most at risk. And so it will be people with lowest incomes, or people that are experiencing household food insecurity, or those people relying on the public sector to provide them with food. So that's one side of food resilience, is to think about, when we are thinking about resilience, protecting those that are most vulnerable. If talking to other people in the food system, and I'm sure Nick will echo this, is about having a more diverse food supply. So in terms of who's supplying us and how we're selling food. And what's the term you used?
Yeah, I remember at the start of COVID.
You're going to have to put on your microphone, Mark.
Sorry, I didn't realise. I usually talk loud enough anyway. I remember at the start of COVID, two members of the London Food Board at that time went to a DEFRA select committee to talk about the impact on supply chains and all that stuff. And one of them, who is chief exec of the Association of Convenience Stores, James Lohman, he said to DEFRA, he said that the importance of pluralising and diversifying supply chains, and that really struck me in that moment and ever since. That it falls on all of us to make a resilient food system that works for all Londoners. That we need as many different routes to market and different kinds of market as possible. Thanks.
And so just thinking about that and thinking about London, I remember, so I've been involved in the food board since 2004. Sarah might have been around as well, and one of our ambitions with 2004 was about street markets, because we know street markets are really good. They're really good for, they might be really good, different markets might be really good for someone like Brian. If you're selling at a farmer's market, if you're producing locally, it might be the right market. And our ambition in 2004 was to have 300 street markets, so kind of every town centre in London got a market, and I believe we have more than that. But there's street markets, there's independent retail, and then there's our incredible wholesale markets. And the role our wholesale markets could be playing with Nick and his members. And there's been work previously done in the markets and still being done in places like Covent Garden Market about getting more local and regional supply into those markets and into London's kind of food system and that wholesale food system. And there's a real opportunity with the development of the markets going out to Barking and Dagenham and working on what that looks like. So we were talking a lot before COVID about what that market looks like and how it can play a role in London's resilience. And I'm sure Sarah can talk about this, but we still have a lot of vegetables and fruit that isn't picked and doesn't come to market. And we have loads of people that don't have enough vegetables and fruit. So where is the mechanism that we can create that can really support that? And I think there's a real opportunity with the redevelopment of the wholesale markets in London, and they're ready for that conversation. So shall I just stop there for a bit? Otherwise I'm going to take up 3 hours, aren't I? Sorry.
Yeah, let's not take up 3 hours just on the first question, because we have got a few others. But you looped in Mark, but you just referred to Nick. So perhaps if I can move on to Nick. Do you want to add to what Claire and Mark have just been saying?
Yeah, so when I think of a resilient food system, it's really one that does its job in meeting our food security needs. And by food security, I mean making sure that everybody has both economic and physical access to a safe, healthy, nutritious, affordable, obviously, supply of food. You know, that's ultimately the job of the food system. And as we've just heard, there's many parts of that. It's multifaceted, right from producers somewhere, hopefully in the UK, but of course from all around the world, through those supply chains, distribution, food manufacturers, food companies, retailers, whether small or large. And so you need all of those functioning functioning well. Now, my perspective is obviously from the beginning of that chain, the producer perspective, and obviously I represent farmers from across England and Wales, but London and other urban centres are hugely important because that is where most of the consumers of our products ultimately are. And I think the point that I'd want to emphasise is that looking at this from your perspective, from the perspective of the London Assembly, it seems to me that actually it's one of those areas where you have a great deal of interest in the importance of national policy, because with the amount of consumers that there are within London, any undermining of the stability and resilience of primary producers of food production in the UK has should be a big concern to Londoners. So at the moment, there are risks on British food production from a number of areas, and I'll just briefly list those, but we can go into them in more detail later if that would be useful. But a lot of these, unfortunately, I try and move on from the debates of 8 years ago, but a lot of these do stem from our withdrawal from the EU, and they include access to labour across the UK, but that is actually a particularly big issue in the surrounding areas of London, and there's certainly a lot of pressure there, both in terms of numbers, actual numbers of workforce, but also affordability of the workforce with labour costs going up. And what we're seeing is actually many businesses, particularly in horticulture, reducing output and certainly holding back on investment at a time when we'd like to see that increased. Secondly, trade policy generally, where we see a direction of travel to increase the amount of imports into the UK. As I say, there will always be imports as part of the UK food system. In fact, it's important because you need that diversity of supply, but you don't want an over-reliance on imports, because what we've seen in the last couple of years, particularly off the back of the Ukraine war, is the fragility of those global supply chains and what those can mean for domestic food supply. So having a robust, resilient domestic production system is really important, and having a trade policy that doesn't support that is potentially problematic. And then we have the approach to agricultural support from the UK, well, from the English government in England. Again, one that it is taking a long time to develop. What we would want to see is a system that allows farmers, or encourages and incentivises farmers to grow sustainably, to move to more sustainable models of production, but key word there, production, continuing to produce food. And there is nervousness that the direction of travel is often away from the production of food, undermining again the proportion of food we eat in the UK and of course in London that is produced on these shores. So lots of moving parts, probably more than there ever have been policy-wise, when it comes to the production end of our food system. And I think lots of those do put a question mark over the resilience of those. So, as I say, those are more national issues, but of course have, I think, undoubtedly huge potential impacts on Londoners.
Thank you. Yeah, some serious food for thought there. Sheila, if I come along to you next in terms of the resilience of a food system for London, or indeed for any other city.
Well, I think one of the keys...
we need you to put your microphone as well.
The keys is lessening our reliance on supermarkets, and because they are in the getting cheaper, screwing farmers and suppliers business. And, you know, I mean, we're living in the midst of this, that, you know, the whole horticultural network in Britain is under threat. I mean, there are great orchards being pulled up right now. And so you've got to you've got to help the independents. You've got to think about what you can do for local food hubs and what you can do for local independents, making it more attractive to people to invest and to be part of those structures. And I know this doesn't go down very well in London, where you have a transport policy which is quite rightly trying to emphasise public transport and walking and cycling. But you have a network of supermarkets in this city who all have gigantic car parks. And I see in my own neighbourhood of Highbury that one of the real drawbacks to using the independents around there is that you can't do very much big shopping because you can't park, or there's hardly any places to park. And I think you've got to think about that. I mean, either you take, I mean, it doesn't seem possible. You're not going to be able to take away those car parks. But it's an inherent unfairness, and it's an inherent obstacle to shopping in another way. And I was listening to Tim Benton. I mean, it's both Claire and Nick have already said this, that I was listening to Tim Benton of Chatham House the other night, and you know, I mean, the reality is that, you know, the Ukraine war, the climate, it's all getting extremely dodgy. I mean, our supermarkets and the global food companies, they are reliant on these, they have been reliant on these extremely steady food chains, and those are fracturing. So London and the UK have to, you know, they have to be ahead of the curve. London has to be ahead of the curve. And so I think this lessen the reliance on supermarkets, and you have to think about how you raise the ease of people shopping in different ways. I mean, it's very hard to break habits. In terms of production, their brownfield sites around the city could be used for veg and fruit production, because that kind of production doesn't require extensive, it doesn't require acres and acres. But if the kind of pricing, that the gouging that supermarkets are doing, it's in this circle that you've got to have people paying fair prices for this kind of production, this kind of semi-urban production. I mean, we have lots and lots of young people who want access to land, who want to work in growing. So, but that hasn't been available. A city like London could make that available. I mean, it is going on in Birmingham, for example. I'm sure it's going on in other places. I mean, in London, you do have the amazing growing communities example of a local food network. And their Better Food Shed wholesale arm is a great model. What can you do as an assembly to use that model? I mean, the Better Food Shed, I think it's 22 or 23 small and medium-sized farms and horticultural enterprises feed into this wholesale hub, which is then used by growing communities. And, you know, they're always looking for more farms to sign up. But again, you know, it's this circle. You've got to get all the elements of that right. When I was doing some interviews at growing communities, they were talking about, you know, the problems of property prices, of you know, warehousing and so on. Well, in the government, as far as I understand it, when the UK government, or I mean Westminster, was initially drawing up their levelling up proposal, part of that was local authorities taking control of buildings to offer to social enterprises. That didn't end up in the bill, but you know, what power? I don't know. What power does the Assembly? What power does the mayor have to do this? I mean, could it be done? I think that's probably all I need to say at this. I'm sure you're going to ask another question later, and I'll witter on further. Yes.
That's one of the reasons why it's really good that you're able to be with us, because the Better Shed project that you've just referred to is the kind of thing that might be of huge interest to us, but we have not previously looked at. But I'm going to move on because I was going to ask specific questions about Brexit and the EU and about COVID-19, and I kind of feel that we have touched on those. I want to move on to asking Sarah, and then I'll come to you as well, Brian, about the analysis that we've had from London. That says 99% of all the food and beverages that supply London are brought in from outside the city, so it's going to build on the comments that people have been making so far. How does that compare with other cities? What can be done about it, and also what can we say about the embodied carbon that's or the carbon that's involved in all of those journeys for that food?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief, but I also wanted to just touch on the sort of notion of resilience, because I think that it's really important to talk about that idea of resilience. And I think that food security and resilience at macro levels often looked at in terms of calories and volume, but what we're talking about is something more about who gets the food and what sort of food is it. And also, I think, Sheila alluded to it, but you can't divide resilience from environmental sustainability. If we've got a system that is constantly depleting our environmental resources, we're importing 47% of veg, I think, here, and 84% of fruit. We're relying on countries where there's water scarcity. That environmental, after all, this is the environment community, that you can't disconnect that environmental story from what. So it's also about the type of food, and the biggest issue around what we would call local food isn't about the proximity and the food miles, it's about the way it's produced and the impact that leaves on the environment. And I think for us, the transition to, we need to de-risk that transition for farmers. So we need to help them be able to do the right type of farming, climate and nature-friendly farming. And so, I think as a city, I haven't got the information for you exactly how we compare to other cities, but we're a big city, and therefore it's going to be accentuated in our city, particularly with the property prices and values of land, which makes it even more difficult. As you say, only 1% of our food we're producing, probably, if that. So we are really, really, we need to see the sort of connection with the farmland outside of London. What I was going to say is that we haven't got this level playing field, really. So the farming that we're talking about is competing with the sort of farming that is destroying the environment, and that's where we need to level the playing field. And there is real opportunities within London to do that, and other cities that you might look to, for example, Copenhagen, have used procurement as a lever and as a driver for that. So what sort of public meals are our local authorities? And at the moment, actually via the Universal Free School Meals programme that the Mayor is funding, you've got a huge opportunity to start to lever procurement. And that would also help us create the infrastructure. So the Better Food Shed is a really good example of the sort of infrastructure. Our wholesale markets are brilliant, but we know they're experiencing challenges in terms of the supply that they get. There's a really big opportunity as the markets move out to Barking in their new home, and working with the corporation to do that. But we've also found that around a very modest conversion of land in the peri-urban area, around 1% of conversion to growing fruit and veg, would produce about 530,000 tonnes of fruit and veg. That would be worth about £3 billion and create about 160. So, you're talking about a very small amount of land for really, really big impact. But getting your hands on that land we'll come on to that later, because that's the sort of mission that me and Brian have been on, is that how do you actually get access to that land? So there is some positive stories in there. Also, the community food grain that we'll come into, we can't grow enough food to feed ourselves in London, but we could move ourselves towards resilience and make people more connected with where their food comes from, which I think is a really important role for us to play. In terms of the embodied carbon in the food that we eat, I suppose the most important thing is about the way that food is produced and the type of food. So we all know that a shift to more plant-based diets is really important in terms of the future, and in terms of hitting nature, in terms of hitting sort of carbon reduction targets. But I'd also say, as part of that, we're in a nature emergency as well as a climate emergency, so you can't forget that element of it as well. So we need to to look at what we call nature and climate-friendly farming. What are the practices that lots of farmers do it anyway, but how do we really value those and make sure that they're rewarded for the right sort of farming rather than the sort of farming which is overproducing and damaging. As I say, I think there are some really good opportunities for, which I can go into a bit more sort of later, for the GLA to sort of act as a leader, to really set the standard, for use its role as an influencer in terms of both national policy, but in terms of local authorities. In London, it's some of those local authorities that own a lot of that land. One in particular is Enfield, and Enfield have done a massive tree planting programme.
We'll come to Enfield in a minute.
They've done a massive tree planting programme, which is fantastic, which was partly triggered by getting money from the GLA. We tried to open the conversation to say, well, actually, you'd only need a small bit of that land to grow food to have a really big impact. But there, I was on the prize of 1 million trees, and we couldn't get the people involved in sort of property management to say, well, actually, you know what, for a really small bit of land, we could have all of this environmental, social and food security benefit for not only us, but for London. So I think, you know, in the future, we'd like to see how GLA can lever those funding opportunities to get local authorities to actually sit around and have some more conversations with us. I'll stop there.
Brian, we've touched on diversity, we've touched on lessons that we may or may not have learnt from Brexit or COVID-19, we've touched on the need to diversify, support people who are doing sustainable farming, diversify outlets where people can get hold of food. And I'm going to mention cargo bites now, because I know several of my colleagues around the table believe that this is part of the way to make sure that we can get away from these huge car parks and big lorries and all the rest of it, and encourage people to go for a very different way of collecting their food. But obviously how we grow it in London and what we can do, we've also been touching on there, and just your thoughts on what people have been saying and anything else you want to add.
Well, I think on the growing side of it, and that obviously that crazy balance of 99% coming from elsewhere and 1% only, realistically, you're not going to switch that round. Obviously, I think London is so big and the land is not available to do that kind of growing. So I think we need to be realistic and say it's got to come from somewhere else. But I think if you're talking about resilience, it's about short supply chains and connecting consumers with their food, so with the producers and with the others in that supply chain. If it's short, it's manageable. People can get their heads around who's handling that food and where it's coming from. However, I do think there is an opportunity to grow significant amounts of food, but that will require quite a lot of changes in terms of people's behaviour and also access to land and competing demands for land. But I think as a long-term goal, it would make lots of sense to see how far you can push that percentage the other way. There's a partner of ours in Waltham Forest who are quite newly set up. They're at 3 years old, lots of young people who are kind of into food growing. They've come through our training programme and now they've set up their own organisation. And what they want to do is encourage people who have got gardens to get food growing in those gardens, and where they don't want to do it themselves, to match them with people who haven't got gardens. And so they've got quite a number of people doing that already. But they've done some analysis just on Waltham Forest. Now, how accurate this is, but I mean, it's just an interesting thought exercise what they've gone through. They've identified that there's 2,000 hectares of land in Waltham Forest, gardens basically, but there's probably that also includes land around housing estates and other things like that, so it's not just private gardens. If you grew at a certain yield level, which is doable on that, I mean, you'd get, they're talking about fairly high yield per hectare. You could supply half the food required for the total number of Waltham Forest residents. I think you'd need to get into a lot of detail around what exactly that looks like and what kind of food that would be. But those sort of numbers just demonstrate if you scale that back down to something that's more realistic, you're still talking about a lot of food. I mean, they're talking about £700 million worth of food being grown.
I've just come in on a complementary stat, which is the University of Sheffield did some analysis, and they worked out within, I mean, obviously Sheffield's not London, but they worked out that they could grow 15% of the city's 5 a day on land in Sheffield. So, you know, you're 15% to 50%, whatever. So you're sort of starting to get to some idea of there's a scale, I suppose, is the point. There's a significant scale at the top end.
So I think, it's an idea, and we're not going to do this instantly or in the next couple of years. But it needs a long-term vision to say that's what we're going to move towards, and then take the steps that actually encourage people towards that. In terms of
that's why we wanted to come back to this investigation, because we have looked at food before, and there's clearly some issues. That's quite shocking, where we started with Claire saying that nobody is responsible for making sure that there is a good food supply, although people are responsible for the supply of an awful lot of other things. However, I am now going to move on. Thank you very much for those introductory comments. I'm going to move on to my colleague Joanne McCartney, who is the London Assembly member for Enfield and Haringey.
So I'll talk to you afterwards. But my questions are to London Food Board and the GLA, and that's just looking. We've touched on this a little bit already, but how does London engage with the UK government on issues of food insecurity and resilience? And in that, do you think the GLA and the Mayor have sufficient powers to be able to lever what we might want to do?
So it's a good question. I'm not sure I know whether we have enough powers. And there are times when the Mayor has approached the government or discussed certain things with the government. So during the kind of Brexit planning, we were directly communicating with DEFRA about our concerns around London. For example, DEFRA hadn't really appreciated the importance of wholesale markets. So we had a direct kind of communication with certain ministries around some of the risks that we were concerned about. Liam, a colleague of ours who sat up in the seats up there, was also, we were talking about some other approaches the Mayor has made, or Deputy Mayors have made to other government ministers around certain things. But in terms of powers, I'm not sure that we have enough powers, or we have those powers, other than maybe around the London plan. And then the budget. I think the biggest powers that I understand the Mayor has is the London plan and then the budget, which can have the most influence. So just going, and I know this is kind of going back a point, but Sarah's point about the free school meals, it's a significant policy decision that could, or is possible to maybe shift policy across the whole of England. And that kind of opportunity around procurement is really significant. So there are other things I think the Mayor has done around campaigning for the protection of removing sanctions from benefits, various other things that would really support this. But in terms of the extent of its powers, I think that I don't have a
mark then.
Yes.
I think, I more or less agree with Claire. As you all know, he has relatively limited powers, and he's done the things that she describes in talking to central government and on getting benefits uprated and all that kind of thing. And a number of the things that he's done in London around under the umbrella of his food strategy are aimed at helping Londoners who are really struggling, like financially and in other ways, to access food. So building local food partnerships in nearly every borough under his Food Routes programme, which has had 3 successive phases now. And of course the Universal Free School Meals programme, which has been extended, as you know, for a second year now. And in 2019 he knew that Londoners were struggling under the burden of being bombarded by adverts for quite expensive, highly processed food all the time in their daily lives, in the obesogenic environment that surrounds especially Londoners in disadvantaged areas. So that's why he brought in the healthier food advertising policy on the transport network that I think Sheila alluded to. And that really started to shift the dial then as well. So I think he has limited powers. He's lobbying upwards to Westminster to get them to change things. And frankly, when there hasn't been a response from those corridors, he's taken the lead in ways that he can. And I think we are, and hopefully everybody else can be proud of that progress that he's made, albeit there's a long way to go.
Can I just add, I think also the other thing is the exemplar programme. So there's the advertising ban, there's the universal free school meals, there's the healthy catering commitments, there's the Good Food for London report. These have all been initiated in London and they're being replicated by other cities. And I think that kind of exemplar approach, modelling something, proving it works, because the healthy catering commitment's been around since 2009. The ad band's now been in for a few years. We've got our second year of universal free school meals. We're getting evaluation from that that's demonstrating such wide benefit, from local well-paid jobs to skills to flexible employment to skills development in an area where we have a skills deficit. So I think, separate to having the powers, it's having the budget and the influence to develop exemplar ideas that are being modelled across other UK cities and across other countries. And I think that's probably some of the biggest value we have, I would say.
If I can pick up on one of the examples that Claire said. So for the last 12 or 13 years, Sustain has run and published an annual report which has been called Good Food for London, and different names at various times. And the new, this year's edition is being launched here in City Hall in 3 weeks' time. And I think, Joanne, you're invited, and maybe you can come. Yeah. Maybe you can't come. I hope you can. And that's a brilliant example, maybe one of the best examples of the Mayor's convening power, and the way that, with Sustain's hard work on that each year, we've been able to encourage all London boroughs to go further than they've done before on a range of around, well, Sarah will tell you exactly maybe, but around 30 different sustainable food indicators, including paying your workers more, including community food growing, including everything you can think of, including universal free school meals now. Yep. And year on year, boroughs make progress and are inspired and shown how to do better next year by their peers in other boroughs. And I think that's an amazing thing that's gone on over those years. So. Yeah, it's an example of how food cross-cuts everything and every GLA policy agenda.
Yeah, thank you. And as Deputy Mayor for Children and Families, leading on the free school meals work, I've listened to what you've said, but I'm not going to give evidence here, because I'm on the other side of the table. But can I just stay with you, really, and ask that in 2021, the Environmental Change Institute published a report for the GLA on enhancing the resilience of London's food systems. And they made various conclusions. So my first is, I don't want to go into the details because we'll come on to some of that later, but a process question, just how are those recommendations being taken forward?
Well, I'm not sure if I did that resilience. It's because we had two resilience reports. Or we had so there was a hiatus in the way that London Food Board was working, and it didn't have a food team for 22 months. So we had no officers dedicated to doing the piece of doing the work of the food board, and because the food team had been moved around different teams. At one point it was in the environment team, then it was in public health, and then the food team was kind of formally removed. I can't remember exactly when.
So perhaps if it's easier for you to write, to refresh what your understanding is of the reporter, because I suspect some of that is carried on. It'd be interesting to see if there's any gaps.
We'll be happy to do that, I'm sure. But a complementary answer to that is, because there was a hiatus, the findings of that report are still valid, and the food policy function in this organisation has started again in August last year. And has been welcomed from across the organisation and from outside. So now we're working out how to pick up the findings and recommendations of that report, and which of them are within our gift. I don't mean mayoral powers, but I do mean that. But also, which of them we can put into effect ourselves.
That's helpful. So a written response after would be very helpful. Can I ask Nick, though, if I can? You talked about the need to diversify our food supply routes. Is actually any action being taken on that? I'm assuming that's primarily for UK government, or is it not?
Yeah, I mean, sorry. Diversity of supply is clearly very important for resilience and food security, and at the moment, we only produce, less, I think, than 6%. This is nationwide, again, 6% of the food we consume is produced in this country. And we've had the figures, obviously, for London is very different, but even nationwide, we rely on imports a lot, and that is increasing. It's going in the wrong direction. And there hasn't been really any national government policy to particularly address that. In fact, I'd argue that policies generally have exacerbated that. What we then saw, and Sheila made a very good point as well about the role of the supermarkets in this, and I think we have to acknowledge that when farmers aren't getting a fair return for what they're producing, then they've only really got one option: they stop producing, or certainly they stop investing. And actually what we saw last year, certainly it was prevalent in London, where we saw shortages on shop shelves. So in particular, a number of salad products, eggs, for example. Most of that was actually as a result of the supermarkets and supply chain failing to respond to rising costs for producers and essentially sticking with their pricing, or even being more aggressive with their pricing. And surprise, surprise, that becomes unviable, and producers don't produce. And then, of course, they're paying even more for the eggs they're having to import from Italy or wherever. So that is an unsustainable model. Maybe that they're reviewing that and they're looking into doing that in different ways. But ultimately, that is not a resilient model. The government. The national government has talked about introducing more measures to try and encourage fairness in the supply chain. It could, for example, look at policing contracts a little bit better. They're very one-sided. They tend to very much favour the supermarkets and the buyers, and looking at how to underpin more fairness in the supply chain is important. But going back to the first point I was making, the other one is actually just looking at ways of supporting British farmers through a number of methods: domestic agricultural policy, the support schemes, other funding for improving productivity, and also, importantly, a approach to imports that makes sure that they meet the same standards of production that British farmers are required to produce to, and that doesn't happen. There's a lot they could do, and actually on that point we're pushing very hard for all the main parties to commit to doing something around what we call core standards, introducing certain environmental and animal welfare standards to apply to imports in the way that they already apply to the way British farmers produce. So there's a sort of range of things there, and I think back to that original question about resilience. It's about making sure there is a sufficient, adequate proportion of British production within that total supply.
I'm just going to echo that there's a total vacuum really at government level in terms of stepping in. They've ditched, the plan for a horticultural strategy, which is really, really needed. But if you look to some of the nations, so if you look to Wales and Scotland, they're in a much better position because they're working with and supporting and planning. So London's in a difficult position because we haven't got that much farmland. Well, I think actually there is quite a lot of farmland, but it's not being used for farming, interestingly, and that's one of the things that would be really useful to look at again. And we are doing a bit of work with the Green Infrastructure team at the GLA on some of this, more from a nature recovery angle, but mapping some of that farmland and where it exists and what it's being used for at the moment, which is probably grazing horses or maybe some arable production, we think, but we are trying to get some information. But I think that the point is we're sort of stepping into a vacuum of people taking responsibility for this, so everything that we can do, we have to do, is about showing leadership. But the places like the Better Food Shed are really, it's fantastic that London has got that. Across the country, they're looking at it as a model, yet they're scrabbling around trying to find new premises because no local authority will offer them a discount, so they're having to look at market rate for premises when actually they're doing fantastic stuff. We'd love to, well, there's not much to see there actually, it's more about the in and out of the process, but we're happy to share more about that.
Okay, thank you. And I think we're not adverse to making recommendations to government as well at this. But I was going to ask Sheila a question actually, and that's, we've heard from both Sarah and Brian that if people actually grew food in their own back gardens, that would increase the amount of food available. But do you get a sense, or have you got a sense of whether the public actually understand the resilience issues we have in our city, and whether they change their shopping habits or their growing habits because of it?
Sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. I think habits can be changed when you've got a structure which begins, I mean, supports, like, I spent a day in a school in Norwich, and very, very, really difficult community. I mean, a economically hard-pressed community. And 5 and 6 year olds were being taught to cook. It's a charity called Country Trust, I think. And what was so astounding about seeing these 5 and 6 year olds cooking, with, using plastic knives and making soup and things, was that this program in these schools had a backward effect on often single parents or children being cared for by grandparents. That you had, because food is not threatening, and children were getting excited by something, and they were talking about food, and it changed attitudes. It changed, what the parents were and grandparents were willing to buy. And it sort of brings me to this point that I think in all our high-flown discussions about supply chains and resilience and sustainability, that it doesn't matter how much food and how much we get people growing in their garden. Well, it does matter. Yeah. But if people can't cook, and right now most people can't cook, you're something. I mean, I know there are other things that are going on, with the inequality and people's low wages and paying for energy. But if people can't cook, which is a basic life skill, you're really screwed. I mean, you're screwed if you're on a low income, and you can do all these other things, but you do need this as a life skill. And I wonder about what the mayor of the Assembly can do, building on the phenomenal success and influence of the primary free school meal program, which I've seen. And it's, who could have imagined it would have such effects? Is what you can do about bringing cooking skills into primary schools. There was an others will have heard about the Fife diet, which in the county of Fife for a while, a few years ago, one of their aims was that every child would leave primary school able to make soup. And if you could leave school, make soup, you could feed yourself for the rest of your life, because learning to make soup is, you can then go on and make anything. So I think cooking gets lost in this. And I think I'm kind of realize I'm not properly answering your question, but I think it's something we have to think about.
Different dimension, yeah.
And the other point, which maybe I won't come to, is that this, the great success of free school meals is that the talking to people involved in chefs in schools now, that one of the things they want to do next is set up a supply, the supply direct from farms, and they're ready to do that, and they've talked to farms, but they're getting caught up in procurement policy, and procurement policy which would be big enough to tip them into cheapest supplier. The way these procurement contracts are worded, and what can the Assembly and the Mayor do about that? Anyway, sorry, I'm going.
Do you mind if I come in? We had a workshop on the free school meals programme yesterday morning, and the things that the London Food Board were asking, Sarah and myself, Stephanie Slater, were how can we use it as an anchor to do more cooking, more food growing, linked to local supply chain. But also we used to have something called Procurement Across London that came out of something that happened called Good Food for the, what was it? Good food on the public plate. Yeah. So this was a piece of work that the GLA did with Sustain 15 years ago. And then the boroughs joined up and did joint procurement, and it was fantastic. And it went directly to Nick's farmers, and we were buying really well-sourced food, and it worked really well because we could guarantee. So we were looking at that again yesterday and saying what we'd love to do with the school food, free school meals going forward is how can it have a wider impact. And we've got the super zones, we've got all of the other things that could complement it, food growing programmes, chefs in schools, to use it as a real anchor to make wider change. But the other thing I'd like to say around skills, and I think this is another real opportunity for the GLA and the Mayor, is the adult learning contract. And in my day job, I'm very much involved in that, and there's a family learning budget within that, where we do nourishing nippers, fun with food, knife skills, and we're training thousands of people how to cook. And that's the budget that the Mayor has at the GLA. And Mark will know that I say about it at every meeting, that I want to look at that adult learning budget. And I know it needs to meet a broad range of needs for lots of things for London, but in terms of health, resilience, food, I think it's got a significant role to play. And I'd love to see it being used in that way. And teaching people how to cook would be a brilliant use of those funds.
Okay, I'm going to move us on, and that's an interesting point. We have, because the Mayor does completely control the adult education budget, so the issue about skills training in terms of cooking, and some very strong points made there by Sheila in terms of learning going back home. Now, Assemblymember Polatsky wants to come in with a very brief comment, and then we're going to go to Assemblymember Bakari.
Very brief, I'll be 60 seconds, you can time me. I just want to pick up where we left off, actually. So, Mark, in my other role as Deputy Leader of the Green Party, I'll absolutely always lobby the government for more powers for London. However, the Mayor does have procurement powers, and this Universal Free School Meals programme has been brilliant, and I'll always applaud it. Isn't this the moment, though, to be looking at plant-based food? Because ultimately it's a triple win. It reduces emissions, it's good for nutrition, provided it's not processed, and of course it reduces bills for the school too. Now, there's an organisation called ProVeg. They've worked with over 5,000 schools in the UK. I've linked them up with the Mayor's office various ways, but it feels like the conversation hasn't moved on. Coming back to this point about skills as well, they also train schools up around plant-based food. It's not about saying no meat at all. It's about making plant-based food the default option, so the biggest on the menu, the most bold for the first one. What work's being done with this?
Came up yesterday.
Well, that was a highly effective 60 seconds, if I might say.
Thank you. I'm rehearsed.
I'll try and emulate that brevity too. I think the time's right for us to strike against all those multiple agendas that you're alluding to, and the workshop yesterday between the London Food Board and the Free School Meals team here is a perfect example of us trying to use that brilliant programme and to add on to bolt on around it co-benefits, including the procurement thing, maybe the largest of all of them, and there's a skills thing that we can look at adding to it as well. I think if we made even a small shift for Londoners towards plant-based diets, that would have the biggest single impact on the carbon emissions that we were talking about earlier, as well as all the health benefits and as well as all the skills and cooking benefits that we could accrue around it as well. So we're really aware of it. That's why yesterday was one of the best examples ever of the London Food Board and its various people with its various expertise on it coalescing with GLA officers. So it's very near the top of our agenda. It may even be at the top of our agenda.
I'll stick to my pledge and be quiet.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move straight on to Assemblymember Bakari now.
Thank you. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about food resilience that we've been touching on and food security, and specifically in terms of the Mayor's London food strategy. So the question to you, Mark, is that the food strategy brought in December 2018 with the implementation plan for 2018 to 2023, and the Mayor states that he wanted every Londoner to have access to healthy, affordable, good food, regardless of where they live, their personal circumstances or income. How did that go?
Thanks for the question. It's still going, and we're not there. We've made a lot of progress. I would say that I was there the day that the Mayor asked us to write a London food strategy. He asked us in October of 2016, a few months after he'd taken office. And that was a really exciting moment in the history of food policy in this organisation. And in his letter where he asked us for it, he said he wanted his strategy to reflect his then and still priorities of economic fairness and social inclusion. And if it launched in 2018, as you said, you can work out, it took us 2 years to write it. And that was a deliberately iterative and very thorough process, speaking to external and internal stakeholders to make sure the strapline is healthy and sustainable food for London. Actually, the strapline could be resilient, helping London become resilient and helping Londoners to be resilient through food, using food as, I don't know, like the lettering through a stick of rock. So we tried, and we still try to have what we call a food in all policies approach here. In this building, and the implementation plan, I think, so that the food strategy is admired by cities across the world for our food strategy, for the architecture and for the way that it explains things and the way that it is quite bold. He's done some really, for want of a better word, in fact there is no better word, quite radical things in that strategy, including most recently the free school meals thing. So when you read the implementation plan, and you'll be aware that an updated implementation plan was published in November, just gone. He's made progress on a lot of those things, and I think nearly all of them, if they're not about environmental resilience, they're about the resilience for Londoners who have, as we all know, let's not go through the three big things that happened: Brexit, COVID, and Ukraine. But those things were thrown at us and thrown at Londoners, and we've used the convening power of the strategy and the leading by example power of the strategy to ensure that nearly everything we've done under that implementation plan is to do with resilience.
Just one example that you could say was a success that you managed to kind of really promote the food resilience in London?
So I think the Food Routes programme, which came out of the cost of living crisis and was developed and is being run by our financial hardship team, it's quite innovative and it's very impactful, and it's in every borough, helping local food partnerships to skill themselves up to focus on the challenges of their particular neighbourhoods and to use food and to source food that is healthy, sustainable and resilient. So at the time of COVID, a lot of people just wanted any food, right? And that's for obvious reasons. But long term, that's not good enough. So, or we don't want to rely on that kind of crisis food intervention. So, helping those local food partnerships to use food that is more healthy and sustainable for the economy, and for the environment and for themselves. I would hold that up as one of our.
But still more work to do.
Yeah, there's lots more work to do. And yeah.
I mean, we touched on, and Sheila mentioned this as well, and as soon as she talked about parking, and then our chair then mentioned cargo bikes, and one of those assembly members who go on about that, actually, because an economy committee that report we did actually highlighted the fact that cargo bikes can make a massive difference. Now, food transport generates nearly 20% of CO2 emissions related to food produce, and the Mayor talks about wanting to reach net zero by 2030. Does this, in part of your strategy, do you include a really actionable way of dealing with food transport in a different way that could transform the way, the concerns are right now about using vans, etc., across London? Have you actually now started thinking about a different way of transporting food around London?
It's actually a conversation we've been having for 16 years, and it's one of the reasons why we did the work around the wholesale, because it's not that easy, and also because we're not in control of those businesses, but it's the work that we did around the wholesale markets and street markets. So people that live near street markets, and I live near street markets, I don't use supermarkets, will shop more regularly. I mean, I get my farm around delivery, I have to say. I get my, and they will shop more regularly, and they might shop on a daily basis. So if you live on Deptford High Street or next to Lewisham, or you live in Hackney, you will shop every day, because you can shop every day, and it's really accessible, diverse, affordable, and you don't need to go to a supermarket, and you don't need a car park, and you don't need a car. I don't have a car. So,
have you read the report on the cargo bikes that we did on the?
No, but it's interesting. I work in Greenwich, and I've been asked to pilot a cargo bike project. So I've been researching cargo bikes for the last few years, and I also did do some work here. We looked at the cargo bikes as well, and separately, I'm a trustee of Borough Market. So we have no parking, and we want local people to shop, and the big issue is movement. And so I think I think there's a real interesting thing there.
I mean, we've got the mayor strategy as well, the cargo bike strategy as well. Interestingly, the Economy Committee also did a report on street markets as well, so please look into that. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of work that we've already been doing as a London Assembly that I think we could be feeding into some of the work that you're doing. We also actually highlighted the fact that there were no meetings held by the London Food Board as well within the Economy Committee, so we'll be talking about that later. So, you know, there are things that I think we should be collaborating on more.
I think we'd really, really welcome that. And now, and as you know, there was no one to service the board. Well, we had a brilliant secretariat.
Well, we'll talk about that later.
So now,
absolutely.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so over to Sheila and Sarah and Nick as well. What are your views of the food strategy, whether it's meeting its requirements and dealing with resilience for London's food system? Nick, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have very...
Microphone again. Sorry.
Don't have very well formed views on the specifics of the food strategy. I think a lot of what's in there is good in terms of intention, particularly around things like procurement. We've heard quite a lot of that already, and actually, again, I speak nationally, but London would clearly play a very important role in this. We believe that government should be much bolder about its procurement strategies around seasonal, fresh, sustainable food, and that would have a benefit for locally produced food. We think there's an opportunity now, particularly post-Brexit, for governments, both national and local, to do that. So that'd be certainly something within the London food strategy that we would want a particular focus on.
Thank you. And Sheila?
Well, I'm afraid I don't know enough about...
I think that's interesting in itself, doesn't it?
Yeah. What I do find interesting about the Mayor's food strategy is that, unlike national government, it has said food matters. And as someone who's been a journalist in food for a long time, one of the real difficulties in this country has been that food and farming are seen as trivial. And this is the Mayor's food strategy has said, no, it's not trivial, it matters. It changes people's lives. It has an effect on the environment, it's joined up. And that seems to me what's crucial about it. And as we've said before, you know, this modelling of the national government was never going to do that about primary school free meals. So I don't know enough about, you know.
But I think that's interesting that you've said that, and I think that's an important point to make.
I mean, it is, you know. I mean, it's one of the ways that, in a way, that the food programme has been able to be quite radical, is that within the BBC structure, you know, there's still this general British thing that food is trivial, you know, and, you know, we must all be working on a programme that's about making cakes. But that lets you do interesting things. Anyway, that's my take on the remarkable things that have come out of the London government.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I would say, you know, I was thinking back to your question about, you know, do people understand about resilience? And I think that we had this moment during the pandemic where people were suddenly like, oh my goodness, what food, you know, food doesn't just appear out of nowhere. And, you know, I don't like to think about it as education, because I think that's belittling to people to say they don't understand it. I think it's about marketing. The way that food is marketed to us is that it just appears out of nowhere. We have supermarkets using fake farm names. You know, we're led to believe that we're in this land of plenty and that it just arrives. So I think the decisions that the Mayor took and the strategy took around limiting marketing of the worst is really bold and is really important for resilience, because it's about, as I talk about, levelling that playing field again. I would also, I mean, just in terms back to the strategy, I think there are building blocks in there that are really important. There's been initiatives been going on for a while, like the food flagship work with London and Ellen MacArthur, that's been looking at directly tackling things like, you know, food waste. And we know that reducing food waste will have a really significant impact on carbon, about, you know, local diverse supply chains. So those building blocks are there. If I was going to be really honest, you know, we had the pandemic in the middle, and then all of a sudden there was a pivot to these missions, and I spent a lot of time personally trying to adapt what we were doing around food to these headings and trying to squeeze them in and trying to get people to... So it's like we'd gone back to a place where I was having to explain why food should be part of that mission or that mission, and is it really about health or is it really about this? And it felt it had gone a bit siloed again. And then in the middle of that, there was all of this change. And, you know, I think that's that's history, and we need to learn from that and move on to say that you do need a named person responsible for food, and that needs to be cross-departmental. The joy and the wonder of the food work is the bits in between all the other silos, the way it joins things up. And if you look at it like that, that's when we'll make a real difference, is when we start seeing it in that way. So I think there was a moment when it sort of lost its way, but I think we're getting back on track now. Things like the Boroughs Food Group that we work with, you know, we call it the jewel in the crown. You know, it's during the pandemic, we had hundreds and hundreds of people working in local authorities turning up. I mean, it was a really important part of our resilience in that moment.
I mean, I think Sustain did actually write a paper evaluating the food strategy, and you did say that you thought it needed to go further. You feel like there has been some progress.
I think we're just literally getting ourselves back on our feet, really, after, you know, reappointing someone to lead on that has got that moment. We're having something like the Universal Free School Meals, like a flagship programme with budget.
I want to talk about farming. Do you think that's something that could be pushed more?
Well, we've just I mean, not even national government's addressing farming properly. So I think there's more that can be done, for sure. There is more that could be done on that. I think if we want to have some vision and we want to have some ambition as a city, then totally. Let's look at, well, what would 1% look like? 1% of the peri-urban farmland that's in London. Exactly. That doesn't sound that unachievable, does it? But let's work back from that.
I mean, that is one of the strategy areas for good food growing, community gardens and urban farming. So, absolutely. Thank you. My last question for Nick and Claire is on the implementation of the food strategy in November 2023, which included updates of a number of areas that strategy has not mentioned. Just very quickly, I'm just going to go through that. Promoting the contribution that food growing plays in providing skills and job creation, we touched on that. Increasing the number of social prescriptions for fruit and vegetables and referrals to community food growing schemes. Working to integrate more SME food producers into GLA and work contracts. I think we've touched on all of those. So I really want to know, what action are you now going to take on those specific areas? What are the projects that you're doing on them? Have any of those been completed?
So just to go back to that point of we've only got Mark in August, we've had no one working on food in a coordinated way for 22 months before that. And Mark is not enough. Now, I think, I'm afraid, he is extraordinary. He is extraordinary.
I think that's so unfair.
Okay, all right. But the food team, I think, is now really well placed in the centre of the GLA. And what we heard from the project yesterday with the free school meals is we have teams working across food. And Tom and the environment team, amazing people who kind of see some of the cross-cutting work. But as Sarah says, you need specialists who can go, what about that a bit in the middle? Because saying to Ros yesterday, okay, the procurement side of this, how do we get small local suppliers into the procurement and get this and help a local authority and a caterer understand the procurement around this? It's specialist work. It's way beyond Ros and the health team, and it should be. We've only got one person to do that for the whole of the GLA and all of those programmes at the moment. It's not enough. Right. We used to have 3 and 4, and it's the point that Sarah says, it's the value. It's the point Sheila just made of the value of food. It just can be seen as, oh, it's a health issue, and we know it's a real complex issue. And the issue, and what you've just said about skills, we have this contract. And if I was going to share any frustration, my frustrations around that, I have 2 people employed as full-time food growing trainers under the adult learning contract in Greenwich. Every borough could have that. And in terms of then working on projects around social prescribing, but we need the projects up and running. We need those connections. I think the GLA and a team working on food could achieve that, but we need the resources here at the GLA to be able to do it.
I'll be hearing you, and like I said, the Economy Committee did do a report on this and made that recommendation, so I think we can reiterate that again. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, it's not the Economy Committee, actually, but slightly before your time, was when I was chairing it, did a whole session where we had some people came in to talk about community food provision, and we also had Richard Walker, who came in from Iceland, to talk from the supermarket perspective. So we have come at this a few times, but clearly, you know, there is still a huge amount to do, and I think we're picking up some potential areas for recommendations. I'm just briefly going to bring in Dr. Onka Sahota, and then I'm going to bring in Assemblymember Emma Best in that order.
Chair, forgive me, I was out for a moment, but I'm really interested to know the contribution of the Mayor's Free School Meals Programme has made to London's food strategy. How has that empowered it and made it much more, given it sort of shape to it, and given. So, what's your thoughts about that, Claire?
So I think it's a real anchor opportunity, and we had, as Mark's just described, we had the London Food Board yesterday, and we had the health team. We also had Andy Gold from Newham, and Newham have had free school meals for 15 years. It was really interesting what Andy said about, we know we say this is a year of funding and another year of funding, same thing happened in Newham. He said, but pretend it isn't like that and think about progression. So to Zach's point, what is a plant-based? What can next year look like? How can we start saying this is where we'd like to go, and I can't remember the phraseology he used, before we make it mandatory, which will be around procurement, could be linked to whole school approaches, could be linked to community, older people, because we have this incredible anchor programme now that is reaching a huge population that we can build things around. Sarah talked about Copenhagen. Copenhagen changed the culture of their food through their public sector procurement, and this is a real opportunity we have, and the school food meals is probably the only, because everything else is a bit split, whether it's care homes, hospitals. It's the school meals is the anchor that we have to really and so much procurement. And Andy said something amazing yesterday. He said, if school meals was a factory on the hill, everyone would be knocking on the door and going to visit it, because that is what it is. It's 1,000 people in every borough working in an industry. So it's such an opportunity. So it was a fantastic workshop yesterday, and I think it's really helped us to say, right, this is what we can do. This is an anchor programme, but it isn't just about healthy meals. This is about procurement. This is about food environment. This is about the local economy. This is about skills development, like chefs in schools, attracting people in an industry that's short of a few 100,000 people. This is a real anchor opportunity for us. So that's what we'd like to do. That's what we are going to do, aren't we, Sarah? Yeah. Definitely. Yes.
I think somebody said if you imagine it all as being one huge restaurant, it's like X trillion covers all being served at the same time at that lunchtime. Assemblymember Best.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask anyone on the panel that wanted to comment on it briefly on looking at London's food resilience and how London's food waste plays into that, and how both can complement each other. Claire, seeing as you're nodding, I'll come to you.
Well, it just seems the worst thing, isn't it, that how much food we throw away and how much it contributes to the embedded carbon, but how much that costs us as individuals from the food we buy. So the Re-London project and the project that we're doing with Ellen McCarthy is kind of setting those kind of targets to try and reduce that. But it's the individual home, food wasted in individuals' homes, that's the most kind of important thing that we really need to address. And so I guess probably one of the most effective ways to do that is the Mayor working with the local authorities, because the local authorities are paying for the collection of this food waste and they have the relationship with the local residents. So it's a partnership between the boroughs and the Mayor, and a communication strategy and how we can really address it. But it's food waste in people's homes that's the most significant. But of course, it's all food waste that's really relevant, but in terms of London. But Sarah, you...
I was just going to say that unfortunately we've got a system that's designed on waste. So the model of the supermarket is a just-in-time, high turnover, low margins, and so what happens is people go home with more food than they need because it's on a buy one get one free. So we had all that idea of getting rid of the buy one get one free offer, but that got shelved. So I think that unfortunately what happens is individuals are doing the job of the supermarket and get rid of that, and now what we have is supermarkets donating that to food insecurity again, and a lot of the food donation projects also talk about then having to waste a lot of that produce and not being able to deal with the fresh. So I think there is something about that model, but I think the Ellen MacArthur stuff around the Re-London work around how we address that is at the household level, but there is something about the sort of systemic, if you're getting your food if you're getting your salad from your garden or from your local market on a regular basis, you're much less likely to waste it. So I think we've shown with a lot of the veg box schemes that there's really much reduced waste than there is with other models. So it's sort of built into the system, but we are trying to challenge that system.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And looking obviously at supermarkets and that being within the gift of national government, if we look regionally, the Mayor of London is currently behind on his own food waste target. Is there anything that he controls that should be in a future London food strategy that you think would help address waste and thereby increase sustainability?
Well, I think that the whole circular economy stuff is, as far as I'm aware, I'm not sort of working on that stuff, but there has been quite a lot of work on how we can sort of how we can design a system that doesn't look at things as waste. So how do you create, for example, I don't need to go on about it, but the Better Food Shed doesn't have waste. It orders exactly what it needs. And things like, looking at procurement and how you design a procurement system that doesn't have waste in it as well, so how do you build all that stuff in? I think that's, but I suppose that's part of the challenge, is that part of that mayoral role is about influencing other players and other providers in that, rather than directly having control of that food system. So yeah, I haven't got specific answers. Food waste isn't something we directly work on at Sustain, but
I think the quick win is just to increase collections for local authorities in terms of green and food waste, but that doesn't solve the problem. Actually, that shouldn't be happening. So I think then the longer term is actual people's connection to food, so that people and communities have this understanding of what the food system looks like and that they're part of it and see themselves in that rather than separate from it. And I think that then you'll just have an incidental sort of win of people just won't waste as much because they'll value it more and understand it better.
I don't mean to digress, but that you reminded me of a point of we have the big, massive wheelie bins in my borough, and you do the food waste with the garden waste. But obviously during winter, you're not doing garden waste, and so your big wheelie bin is probably like this much full, and so it just gets left, and then it's getting stinkier and stinkier because no one's picking it up because it's down
now
here.
We are digressing.
I think there's a point around making sure that not only are collections scheduled, but they're being actually enacted. But that was the end of my questions, but I didn't know if Claire had a comment.
No, we need to. We are getting slightly behind, so sorry. And we did talk about waste and recycling, and including food waste before Christmas, as you know. And I want to move along
Perhaps
to.
If Claire has a point, though, she could write to us.
She can. Well, you had 3 members of the panel respond to you on a point that we weren't covering in this session. I want to move on to Assembly Member Devenish, who is going to pick up the questioning where we were just talking about. The Mayor's actions around the London food waste strategy and whether they are sufficient.
Thank you, Chair. There's no food waste in my house. I'm too mean, so I just point that one out. To the GLA and LFB, the November 23 update to the food strategy implementation plan doesn't include any timeframes for action, which is surprising because obviously Mr. Khan usually has timeframes on all his plans. When do you expect these to be completed, please?
I'm afraid I can't give an update on
that. The short answer is I wasn't involved in revising the implementation plan, and you're quite right that it doesn't say a time on that. We're working closely with particularly the food waste and circular economy team, so we can come back and provide you with a written answer to that, but I don't know what timescale they're working to, other than their targets of reducing food waste by 50% by 2030.
Sure. I mean, a written answer will be fine, ideally before March the 19th, when we sort of go on holiday for what's called PERDA. Are there any plans for the new food strategy or thoughts about what it might include, though, please?
I think in line with other teams around the building who are responsible for strategies, we'll be waiting until an incoming administration to get a steer on what updates to existing strategies or new strategies they would like, and we'll be here ready and willing to help on that, and we would love to do more on this agenda, so I look forward to that.
I can tell you that the board members have a load of ideas about things that we'd like to develop, but we'll be closely involved with that if we're still the board, and we have strong ideas of where we'd like to develop this, so we'll So there is a lot more we'd like to include. So.
And can I be cheeky and ask Claire if you'd be prepared to drop a line again, maybe just giving some of those themes, because it'd be just not a long answer, but those themes of what you'd like to, because I think it's always good to get those out there in the public debates.
I would really like to, yeah.
Thank you very much. How many members are currently on the board? Can anybody answer that one? It's always difficult, isn't it, these kind of questions? You can write to us as well. Yeah. What project is it currently prioritising? Can you answer that one?
Yeah, there's a few that we're looking at. So there's been obviously the school food meal, the free school meals is really important to us. The relocation of the wholesale markets is really important to us. We look a lot at things like food routes. I chair the borough's food group, so that's that group that Sarah told you about, which gives us intelligence and helps us with implementation. And then the other thing you can tell is a pet issue of mine is the adult learning budget, which I really want to revisit. So we're trying to be thorough about going through areas, deep diving into areas, seeing how we can input and support. So the free school meals is obviously going to be ongoing. I think the wholesale markets is really, really important to us going forward. And I think those are the things that we've got mostly set up for March. Yeah. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, and Claire's covered more or less everything, and I would add to that resilience and how do we pick up the recommendations and findings of the Oxford University resilience report that came in almost 2 years ago. Given the hiatus, now that we're at least partially back, how can we take that forward in the next administration?
Thank you. And what is the role of the borough's food group in relation to the food systems and resilience, please?
Yeah. So when we first started. When we were looking at the food system in London in 2004 and looking at a strategy, what we'd realised was that when you talk about trading standards, business kind of incubation, planning, environmental health, public health, they all sat in the boroughs. So what we recognised is that if we were going to implement a strategy across the whole of London, we needed a partnership with the boroughs, so that the mayor had a particular role, and the mayor has a role with developers and new developments, and has a convening role, he has a communications role, he has the London plan. And we needed to understand how that worked with the boroughs. So some of us, I have a borough level role. Sarah at the time, I think, had a borough level role. I had this knowledge of what we could do at borough level that we couldn't do without the mayor, and what we believe the mayor needs the borough to do. And so in 2009, we launched the borough's subgroup as this kind of intelligence subgroup, and I chaired it, I think, in those early days to give us that kind of on-the-ground intelligence. It's worked amazingly, because when we've looked at things like food poverty plans, healthy retail plans, the GLA and the mayor have kind of launched small grant programmes. The boroughs have bid for them, and they really are small. They're like £5,000 or £10,000, and the borough used them to create an exemplar that we then encourage all the other boroughs to replicate, and then it becomes part of the Good Food for London report. So it's this really circular, innovative, kind of really effective model. So as Sarah was saying, during COVID, when we were convening the boroughs group, we were up to 200 to 300 people attending and sharing innovation on vulnerable groups, on refugees, on moving surplus, on how they were creating surplus hubs. So I think what's really good is recognising those different roles and the things that the boroughs have statutory responsibility for, but how they give us on-the-ground intelligence, but how they can also be really innovative. So it's a really brilliant thing, and yeah, we were worried about its continuation, but there's been a commitment now to continue to support the boroughs group. So yeah, it's quite an extraordinary group to come to.
Excellent. Thank you. Please.
One point I just wanted to make was about the Sustainable Food Places, which is a programme, which is a nationwide programme of around 90 food partnerships. And I can't remember what year London got its silver award. But
2017.
2017. One of the things I'd really like to see is that London join some of the other cities that have gone for gold, and to see how we can really raise our aspirations to be awarded continue to be like leading the fold of what we can achieve. And I suppose the only other things I just wanted to mention was we didn't really touch on some of the planning stuff and the work around London Plan, and just sort of trying to reinforce those physical, spatial aspects of because that is within the Mayor's gift to influence that, and sort of really making sure that we make the most of those opportunities. And the other, I just also wanted to flag the work around the nature recovery, which I mentioned earlier, which we're doing with the Green Infrastructure team, which I think again is a real opportunity, particularly to reach out to the farmers. And it'd be good to get a hand from anyone that's got links with those, but to really reach out to the 197 farms that do exist within London, and to really see that as an opportunity to sort of engage with that physical spatial element that's within London. So I think that would be quite a strategic aim for us to take on board.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you, Sarah, if you'd write to me in terms of how we could get to gold. How and when do you think we could get to gold? And then I can put it to my friend the Mayor.
Yeah, great.
Brilliant, thank you. And my final question, I'm sorry I have to ask this, it's always because the Mayor does talk about transparency an awful lot. The minutes of the London Food Board meetings have not been published for recent years. Why has this occurred, please, and when will these be uploaded, if possible, please?
Well, I'll ask I can ask the person who now supports the committee. The way the board was supported got changed when the food team were removed, and a lot of the comms, I don't know if you've seen the picture of the food board, but I mean, I wish I still looked like that now, because it's quite old. So what we can do is we can talk to Adam, who's phenomenal, who's in the kind of committee services, and ask. We'd love them published. We'd love everything we do published. Because I think, to Hina's point about this, we would love everyone. I take this everywhere I go. We'd love people. I talk about it in the work I do. I help people start food businesses, and I refer to it all the time because we'd love everyone to know about it. So, yeah, I think that's an area we'd like more awareness, and so we'll ask Adam, can we, to see if we can get them?
I'll surely ask him. I don't know. Last week we realised that maybe there had been a problem with our website, and so we spoke to the people who run the whole of the website here, and they found out that accidentally by someone not connected to us, it had been the food board section of the website had been archived. So now it's been, what's the opposite of archived? Unarchived. It's back live. So since last week, I think. So yeah, if the minutes aren't there, then I'll find out where the minutes are, and we'll be sure to put them up.
Thank you very much. If it makes you feel any better, I'm still using my 2001 general election photos. I look much better, on the same age as Zach and Emma in those days. Thank you.
Well, we'll be the judge of whether you look better in those photographs or not, Tony, but that's an entirely different matter. I'm going to move straight over to Dr. Onka Sahota, who's going to pick up the questioning. And can I, at this point now, say that we are running slightly behind, and if everyone could be concise in their questions and answers, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Some of these things may already been covered, so this is a great opportunity for you to be succinct. It's about the impact of the restructuring of the GLA food team. Previously, at the start of the strategy, the team consisted of 4 members, and as you've told us, it now has 1. I mean, what has been the impact of this, and how have you coped with 1 ride rather than 4?
I mean, it was a very worrying time for us as a board, and I think you might be aware of a letter that was compiled by board members and we sent to the Mayor as a response to the suggested restructure. I understand the need for the restructure, and I could also understand why departments having a team of 4 people just focused on food maybe didn't make sense to them. But as you can see from today, this is a huge amount of work. If we can achieve the things that we know we can achieve, and to make sure we make the most of the opportunity of food in London, including future resilience, we need more than 1 person. However, just to reiterate what I said before, the move to Jeremy's team, to the strategy team, has been really good. It's really effective. It gives us that cross-cutting kind of position now. So I think to expand a team from there that makes sense and doesn't feel like it's invading another team. So because, as I said before, it had gone from environment to health to economy to... It's a central subject, and centrally positioning it and building it from there makes sense. So we'd really like some more resource.
I can understand that it's like health, right? It sits in all policies, but you still want someone to focus on health. So I understand that. So how is the food policy coordinated at the GLA currently, and how do you ensure that there's ownership at high level in the organisation on this area?
Well, what has happened in the change is that we have a mayor advisor coming to the meetings, which is really, really good. So where the change happened, we've had more senior engagement in every board meeting, including yesterday's meeting. The other thing that's happening at future board meetings, and maybe this was making up for the less dedicated staff, is senior staff from the environment team, senior staff from the health team, senior staff from the economy team, and I would like that to continue. Mm-hmm. But what they're listening and they're talking to us, which is great, but they're probably what they don't have is the capacity to then pull this work together and understand the complexities. But the fact that they're coming to the board meetings, listening to the conversation, the wider conversation, and presenting to the board meeting is been really effective, and I'd really like that to continue. So in a way, part of it felt like we had a smaller dedicated group, but much wider engagement and much wider understanding. So I think there's been some positives that have come out of the restructure. It's not all negative.
Did you say anything, Mark?
Yeah, if I may.
Yes.
And some might say uncharacteristically, I'm going to give a very positive, forward-looking interpretation. For reasons that may be obvious. So the fact that someone is back now since last August, even though Claire said I'm not good enough, what she meant is we need. I know what she meant.
She wants more of you.
No, we understood. She just wants you to be cloned so that there's at least 6 of you.
I can assure you, she certainly doesn't want me to be cloned. We've known each other 2 decades. The fact that when I came back, the fact that there was a food policy coordinator back in the building or back in the organisation was warmly welcomed by policy teams and when I came back, I realised they'd all been doing great stuff, in some ways even more stuff than I had hoped in the 22-month hiatus. But it needs someone, more than one person, to pull those things together and to see commonalities and to see co-benefits of different teams working together. As Sarah said earlier, food's not just an environmental thing, it's a health thing too. So if there are synergies to be had and benefits to be made for Londoners out of joining the people in those 2 teams together, then let's go for it. And another part of my role, obviously I support the London Food Board, but I also act as like the eyes and ears of the organisation. So I speak to external stakeholders all the time, you know, in industry, in every bit of the food system, really. Yes. So working on the Brexit barriers that came in a couple of weeks ago and are coming in successively this year. What does that mean for us? Who do we need to get around the table in this organisation? So I'm kind of like the role of the person in my post is a bit like being a canary in the coal mine. So if we can see a problem down the line and coming quite quickly towards us that policy people can't do because they're too busy doing their health thing or their environment thing. I don't mean to decry that by describing it like that, but someone else who's looking at the horizon and can bring people together to avert problems and build on successes. And that's the role of a food policy expert who cuts across the whole thing. So food in all policy.
I think you make a very powerful argument about that, but the question is one of you enough, Mark? No. That's the question.
With respect, and I understand why you asked that, I'll choose not to answer that because it's not really for me to say. I think you can hear from people on the panel today that they would welcome more resource and we could be even more impactful. We're very ambitious. We know we've done some things really well. We want to do a lot more and we need support for that. That's how I would answer that question. Thank you.
Yes,
I mean, I would say no, and I think part of that is about the missed opportunities all of the time. That you know, there's only so much Mark can do, or one person can do on their own, and I think there is a real opportunity lost because you know this sector can lever in lots of funding for London. I mean, you've only got look at places like OrganicLea and the work that Sustain do. We lever in a huge amount of funding into the capital to do stuff, and there could be more of that if there were people out there making these connections and synergies, and you'd be surprised that maybe you won't be surprised, but when you've got the GLA support and backing for the work that you're doing, it goes a really long way with funders. So the work we do on capital growth and now funding from the City Bridge Foundation, it's really important that we can say that we're in partnership with the GLA on that work. So I think that, the more that you invest, as long as that's clearly part of a strategy and that there's some clear targets there, that you'll sort of reap the benefits from having more than one person in that team.
Yes, certainly. And the other thing is, what's the most recent funding allocation from the GLA for the capital growth network? Who's best to answer that question?
Well, I can tell you because, we get it. I think we have just finally agreed on £15,000 for the year for capital growth, which is a sort of small contribution towards the work we do. I mean, as I say, that it's partly about the partnership that we've got with the GLA and how important that is. We were sort of, when we lost the food team, put into health, and I think it's weirdly taken health a little bit of time to understand how we link with their work. They don't understand the infrastructure that we're providing across London, so they've got us doing some other little projects, and actually we're also now doing a project with the environment team separate to that, so we're actually liaising with two different departments, which is fine and it's great, but it would be nice to have that sort of overarching work. We would like there to be much more ambition around the food growing. I mean, you can see everywhere you go, people love food growing, and it's been a real another jewel in the crown of the mayor and different mayors, right? So it's not just pinned to one political party, and I think that it's a real positive universal story. So we'd be all up for talking about how we can strengthen and widen that, how we link it in with other funding programs that the GLA already has, and how we attach it to the universal free school meals, the school super zones. There's loads and loads of opportunities to be much bolder and ambitious again with your food growing program. So yeah, we welcome that.
And has the funding levels changed over the years, rather over time? And is there a budget in place for the year 24-25?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get anyone in trouble. We're sort of told very last minute about, at the moment, whether there is. I think people are sort of, finding money where they can to try and keep that relationship going. Yeah, I mean, we got lots of money back in the early days when we were creating when we were creating 2,000 new growing spaces. So we were giving out grants on behalf of the GLA. So, at that point, we had like hundreds of thousands of pounds that we were giving out. We weren't keeping that money. So obviously, naturally, over time, that dropped. And then gradually there was an idea that it would taper, and then it stopped for a bit, and now we've got a little bit. So yeah, it's reduced. We're getting money in from elsewhere to help that, but match funding is really important. As I say to funders, they want to see that other people think it's a good idea as well as pulling in some of the other things that are going on. So the Growth Fund, for example, has funded sort of bigger programs and bigger projects, some of this peri-urban stuff that we've been talking about. So I think it's not just about the direct funding, it's also about the relationships with other pots of money and other programs that are going on. Does that make sense? Sorry, I feel like I waffled a bit there.
Makes sense to me, I think. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. We are going to take a comfort break. So it's 15:38, so we're going to come back at 15:48. And we'll talk about growing in the next few sections.
I'm going to have to call you all to order, and I will be banging the gavel in a second. If Guy, could ask the Assembly members to rejoin over here. Joanne McCartney. Sorry. Now with added microphone. Okay, so we just paused just before we came to the section of the questions, and we're having a great session. So I think some of the things that we're planning to ask you we may already have touched upon. But we are now going to talk a lot more about growing, farming in the green belt, metropolitan open land. We're going to talk about community growing. There's a whole series of areas to do with growing that we want to cover with you today. And thank you very much so far for your expert input. And I'm going to move to Assemblymember Emma Best, who's going to pick up the questions around farming.
Thank you. I just want to start by asking what the opportunities and trends for farming in Greater London are. And whether there's many food-producing farms left. I don't know, Nick, if you wanted to open on that.
Yeah, I'm sure others have some comments as well. But I mean, obviously, compared nationally, the opportunities are limited. But there are farms, a number of different types of farms within London. So there are clearly opportunities there. I mean, I think when it comes to I would say large-scale farming, but I don't mean sort of what some people might term as factory farming. I just mean broad-acre farming over significant areas of land. There are probably not very many opportunities for expanding that. Most of the decent agricultural land, farmland that can be farmed actually across England and Wales is already done, and actually some people say the problem is that there is marginal land which is farmed as well. So good land, and there's a lot of good land around in the southeast and around London is already farmed. So I suspect the opportunities are more around using brownfield sites, looking at vertical farming, etc. There are already good farms operating within the London area, certainly.
I don't want to slightly contradict, but so the stat I've got is that 59% of London's green belt is actually classed as agricultural land. There's a lot of agricultural land. A lot of it is actually quite good quality. I mean, probably not as good as some of the highest quality agricultural land, but it could be farmed. It probably is. I think that's 94,000 hectares. So it could be farmed for local markets, but what often is it's more often used for grazing horses, as I mentioned earlier, maybe some of it's arable, but unfortunately a lot of it is sitting there with hope value. So I'm sure a lot of you will understand that, which is the idea that someone hopes that one day the regulations will be dropped and they will be able to make lots of money from that land. And unfortunately, I think that includes local authority property departments as well as private developers. So there's this idea that one day that land could release a lot of financial value. So it just sort of sits there. We know from the DEFRA does an agricultural survey, we think there's about 197 actual farms within London, but we know, I don't know them. And I've tried to get to find out who they are. So we are going to do a bit of work in trying to find out a little bit more about what they do. We know there's things like a lavender farm, and we know there's some pick your own. What we have got is about 6 really, really good, what we would call sort of community agroecological farms, one of which Brian could probably tell you a bit more about that. So these are farms that are showing like exactly how a farm could operate in the peri-urban area and make it more viable. So they're doing training, they're doing engagement with the community, they're bringing in produce from other farms via the Better Food Shed to sell to local customers via bed boxes, and they're also growing some of their own food. So I think in terms of that, the biggest, obviously, asset you need is land, right? There are opportunities for vertical growing and indoor growing, but that's another slight debate. But actually, if you're going to do that, you're better off doing that outside of London anyway, because the profit will be cheaper. So, you're not going to do a lot of indoor growing within London. Rooftops aren't really, they have to have been built with growing in mind. Retrofitting onto rooftops is, so there's a lot people like those technological fixes, but I think unfortunately in London it's probably not really, it's good for firing the imagination, but it's not really very practical. In terms of the trends in farming, as we know, we're losing farmers nationally. I mean, farmers are getting fed up. And you may have seen the campaign run by Riverford in trying to raise awareness in government around how farmers are just getting stitched up. So I think generally there is a trend a little bit away from farming. But interestingly, we are seeing a lot of I don't know if they are really young, younger than me, but people actually really interested in a career on the land. So there is actually this weird trend of people wanting to work in this area, but trying to create and make viable careers and create land access opportunities is the challenge. OrganicLea train huge amounts of people that go on to work in farming, growing, other bits of the food sector. Often they leave London when they get to the point where they want to go into farming, because we're the land that we do have in London is a bit landlocked. We can't actually seem to find a way to access that land. So we're always on a mission to try and unlock that. Does that answer your question?
That's massively helpful, yeah.
Can I just add something to that?
Yes.
Because you used, Sarah, the expression marginal land, and something that we a program we made, a food program. The food program runs the BBC Food and Farming Awards, and the winner of the producer category in 23 was a woman who'd Carrie Rhymes, a cheesemaker in North Wales, not far from Bangor, and it just forced me to think differently, because what she'd worked as a senior civil servant and only come into cheesemaking in her 50s, and what she had recognised through her work is that what we call marginal land, and what Nick might call marginal land, is often land that is complex, and that has complex herbs and flowers, and it's not good land where you could produce fantastic wheat or the commodity crops. And so this woman has built a wonderful cheese business from traditional breeds that were already being grazed on this marginal land, and in North Wales and on Anglesey, which produces this sheep's milk of great nutritional complexity and richness. And it wouldn't be possible to do as the quality that she is creating if on good land. It's a way of using marginal land. So what I'm trying to say is that marginal land is not always marginal. It depends. You have to think more creatively about what to do with it. And what you might do is something which is good for the land. You graze the land, you lock carbon into pastures, and producing food of great quality.
Can I just, sorry,
can I just come back to unless it was on specifically this, I just wanted to pick up quickly, Sheila, on that point you raised around how she's managed to do that on that marginal land in North Wales. Is there something that we could learn for London that would encourage that?
The grants, low-cost grant was available from I'm not sure London can learn. I don't know you're in the position of making grants, but as Sarah said before, Wales and Scotland are better at supporting their farmers than we are, and so she got grants and loans that made this business possible. That's if you wanted to do that in the London Greenbelt, I don't quite know what support would be available.
I was just briefly going to sort of expand on that a little bit, because I think some of the discussion listening to it today, a lot of the focus seems to me to be primarily around fresh produce, particularly sort of horticulture and vegetables. And obviously, when we think about farming, it's quite a disparate and often quite, there are quite distinctive sectors within farming across England and the UK, which will feed Londoners. So, important point, what Sheila was just saying is that actually a lot of our livestock production, including dairy production, is on more marginal land. So land which you can't really grow decent crops on, but you can grow very good grass on. And actually, England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland are all very good for growing grass in a global global sense, and they're not good for growing plants or crops to eat. So if you want decent protein, actually growing grass and grazing is not a bad idea on that. Most of that is towards the West Country, not so much around this part, but around in the southeast it's more better quality land, better for growing vegetables, better for growing arable crops. And of course, arable crops, wheat, grains, barleys, etc., are global commodities that you're not going to be delivering straight necessarily into small outlets, small supply chains, certainly in any volume. So it's very disparate, and I think we need to be careful sort of just sort of wrapping everything up into a kind of single sense of what the farming and food chain looks like in the UK, and there's a point there as well to Zach's point about plant-based diets. We are good actually at rearing meat, and comparatively the carbon impact of that globally is important. So while I recognise the desire to eat less meat, I would say it's something we want to do through eating locally produced meat rather than eating no meat at all, because you definitely have a better impact on your carbon footprint if you eat lower carbon local meat than some of the meat that's produced in other parts of the world and imported into the UK.
Okay, thanks. We might be a slightly conflicted committee on promoting increased dairy use, but I think the point's well made. I just wanted to, guys, we need to progress a little bit. Sarah, come back to those 197 farms that you know of, but it seems you don't know too much about them. Is there any inclination that they're diversifying away from food production, or do you just not know?
Totally, yeah. I think the chances are that they're either growing, grain that's going into the big commodity market, or they're not actually growing food at all. So I think that's where what we really want to understand. There's a lot of small tenant farmers, for example, down in near where Sutton Community Farm is, and the same up in Enfield. There's a lot of tenant farmers there. So the land's actually owned by the local authority in some of these situations. It's like, if we can't get through the local authority to get to these, how are we ever going to get to sort of some of the more independently owned ones? So yeah, I think that there is a bit of work to be done, and it's great. It's quite hard for me and others to do that on our own, but what's really good now is that the green infrastructure team are sort of interested in it from the nature recovery point of view, because they see this opportunity, I suppose, for rewilding out there. What we want to do is sort of not polarise it so much between rewilding versus food production. You can actually produce food and have really wild areas. If you ever go up to OrganicLea, you'll see that it's full of wild areas and trees and absolutely harmonious with nature and biodiversity, but they're also producing food and helping people learn. So the other thing, just to come in on this, is the growing communities have actually got this, what they call a food zones model, which is they've actually calculated how much of our food could come. So they're talking about 2.5% could be produced in sort of domestic, homegrown, urban areas. About 5% could be commercially produced in urban areas, and then about 17.5% could be produced in the peri-urban area. So that they've actually sort of worked out a food zones model where your freshest stuff is grown closest towards you. And we've talked about it, I think it's probably your term, but market garden cities and that market garden renaissance idea that we had once upon a time around London, and how we can sort of bring that vision back to life again would be really exciting.
Thanks. And so on the Greenbelt land we talked about, and as well metropolitan open land, you said earlier that there's the problem of hope sitting on this land. So is there any way that you would suggest that we can get past that? And as a first question, the second question being, what would the impact of that be on the food resilience and supply in London? And the third question I would have on that Greenbelt and metropolitan open land is, are the protections in place at the moment sufficient and working to protect that land? Sorry, that was a mouthful.
No,
I was just trying to...
I was in the last London plan, process, and it's quite intimidating when you're sitting there with local authorities who brought along QCs to try and argue against policies that protect the green belt, because essentially they want to, and I understand local authorities financially are in a difficult place. A lot of the people within local authorities are looking at those assets from a purely financial point of view. I think there is something about holding strong and being really clear on that's not going to change. We are going to protect some of the most valuable agricultural land for the things. But I think the absence of development doesn't mean that we're actually creating benefit in that land. So I think it just has to be incentivised. How can we incentivise the production of food and the other assets that come with that? So that's what the conversation we tried to have with places like Enfield is like the value in this land isn't just about the financial, it's all the other things you're trying to achieve as a local authority, the jobs that you could create, the skills that you could build, the environmental assets. So I think helping us to push forward and demonstrate that with a local authority would be a really great opportunity. I talked before about how you've managed to do that with tree planting, and I think the same could be done in terms of using a sort of case study local authority to actually sort of take charge of this issue and see how they could play a role in actually increasing resilience and food production in a borough. Would be a really interesting one from my point of view. So yeah, as I say, I'm not like a planning expert. I've been in enough, but I think it's just about really being clear that that's not going to change, but also incentivising the actual use of that land for production of food rather than grazing horses.
And
nothing against horses, by the way.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if anybody on the panel especially wanted to add onto whether the protections currently are working, and if we could get that land moving, what the benefit would be. But I'll bring in you.
I don't know the answer to the latter part of that question, but I spoke to the planning team last week in anticipation of this kind of discussion this afternoon. They said this one sentence to me, and hopefully it provides succour or confidence. The principal power of the London Plan is in protecting Greenbelt and Metropolitan open land from inappropriate development, and by making sure that boroughs demonstrate exceptional circumstances if they propose to change boundaries through their local plans. So the planning team, the London Plan does hold that firm line.
And do you know if that special circumstances clause has been used?
Exceptional circumstances. I don't know how often it's been used, if at all.
Okay. Sorry, I saw a hand over here, Brian.
So in terms of the benefits that can be gained, Sarah's mentioned OrganicLea, my organisation, and maybe it serves as an example of what can be achieved. We've taken on 12 acres of local authority land, ex-council nursery, but much of that is not cultivable because of large, important trees that are on it. But there's about 5 acres that we do farm on, and from that, we do a number of other things. We've created a diverse business model, but that's what's possible in a urban or peri-urban situation. We're employing 25 people, 30 people per year. We're turning over £1.5 million. And then we've got all these multiple benefits of trainees, volunteers, health programs happening, as well as our core business of growing food and selling it to local people. And we're sequestering carbon already. We're not thinking about net zero. We've gone past net zero about 5 years ago. So we're sequestering 11 tonnes of carbon per year mainly through our cultivation techniques. It's not the trees on site. It's our soil management.
Sort of poaching a little bit into the next.
Yeah. So just to finish up on the farming section, Nick, I wanted to come to you briefly because you were speaking earlier about occupation shortages, and I think the shortage occupation list at the moment for visa permits specifies fishing more than any other agriculture work, and this assembly's been quite successful in talking about other occupations such as in construction and getting those added. Are there any occupations that you feel are lost off that shortage occupation list for visas that we should be recommending and lobbying are added?
Yeah, well, we submitted a recommendation to for consideration on the shortage occupation list, so we can share. I'm very happy to share that with the committee. my understanding is that the Migration Advisory Committee have now recommended actually getting rid of the shortage occupation list anyway, as part of the government's review of the whole immigration process. So it may be that that route is no longer viable in any case. What we do have in agriculture is a specific seasonal scheme for seasonal workers, around 40,000 seasonal workers, which is lower than it used to be, but is been useful, has been not as much as we would have wanted, but has been helpful in allowing seasonal workers in horticulture into take up some of those roles over the last couple of years, and there's a much smaller amount for poultry workers as well. So those are temporary. There's every chance at some point in the future that they may be taken away. And the problem that we've found is that it's very, very difficult to find that labour from the domestic workforce, even though we've tried various different schemes to do that. There don't seem to be jobs that people particularly want to do from the UK. Automation is another route that is a potential solution, and I think over a longer term there will be more automation in some of those sectors, and that will reduce the need for labour, but that's a long game. That's not happening soon. So horticulture, seasonal workers is a big one, and then other things like, as I say, poultry, dairy sector as well. There will be requirements, but I can let you know exactly what the specific numbers that we suggested were. But as I say, I just put a caution, because I think that the whole system is under review at the moment.
Thanks, Nick. And just finally, we're seeing at the moment the massive protests across the EU for farmers. I think there's a massive one again in Spain, blocking the ports in Barcelona, Malaga and Valencia. Sarah talked earlier about some unrest. How likely are we to see anything like that here and disrupting the food market in London? Is that something that you would say is likely, or...?
Well, I wouldn't want to make a prediction on it. We certainly feel that protest is perfectly legitimate, but we would like to see it as a last resort. At present, we have got lots of gripes, has been alluded to on a few occasions, but at the same time, we're having pretty constructive conversations with all the parties, and I think while we're doing that and occasionally making some progress, that's the sensible way forward. But there's no doubt that there is discomfort out there about some of the direction of travel around farming, but hopefully at the moment we can maintain sort of constructive dialogue rather than take to the streets quite yet.
And if there's anything helpful this committee can do to stop the taking to the streets, then perhaps you could let us know, maybe through writing, when you let us know the other things.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll be pleased to hear from you all on how to organise or how to stop food riots. I just wanted to come in on this section. I actually want to just address this to Nick, and it's quite interesting, the points that were being made by Sarah and Sheila about marginal land, because quite a lot of the open spaces in London are not just the green belt, but we also have this designation of metropolitan open land. Also, heaths and commons, which quite often have their own local, quite strong protections, and they are there partly because they were pretty rubbish land that wasn't much good for anything else. They may have been used, for example, on Tooting Common. The last time it was used for growing anything was Dig for Victory during the war, and sometimes at certain times of year you can actually see the shape of those gardens that were being used at that time. But it's pretty, the soil is not good in many parts of London. Some of it's all sort of sand and gravel and that sort of thing. If you go outside of London and you find in areas where this sort of land is being used for grazing and things like that, we've got acid grassland in some parts of London. The way to keep acid grassland as acid grassland is actually seems to be to graze sheep and cows on it outside of London. Do you think there would be any mileage for London to think about doing that, particularly bearing in mind Sheila's description of North Wales and being able to... I don't think you could have enough sheep to have a forest of sheep to feed supermarkets or even smaller hubs, but cheese and things like that?
I mean, possibly. I think it would be a fairly small scale, but certainly yes. I mean, there is a lot of what we'd call livestock finishing, which goes on around this around London, this part of the world, on that land, which isn't probably quite good enough for crop production, but you can finish sheep or cattle on that, which may have been bred and raised upland up in the hills and then moved. So it's perfectly possible, and actually there's sort of more interesting recent developments for people to go back to more mixed farming models in some places where you're got an arable rotation going on, but in part of that arable rotation you're actually grazing fields for a few years, so you're restoring the soil, nutrients, soil balance, etc. And so there's a sort of market, as it were, for grazing and finishing livestock. But as I say, I think probably within London it would be fairly small scale.
Okay,
I think what came out of the Carrie Rhymes, the cheese example, and also of another farmer I know in South Wales who supplies organic beef to Waitrose, is that again it's the supermarket standards for animals for meat are for the big rear ends, and whereas what we're talking about with the sheep, which that Carrie Rhymes is using, but which also go into the meat market, and also the beef producer in near Abergavenny, is that they are the traditional breeds which could live on much more marginal land and not eat imported soya and so on, are not wanted by the supermarket because they're too small. And that's been, you'll know that from Borough Market and the Herdwicks, and that people are happy to eat those kinds of meats, but the supermarkets are, they're very locked into standards, these size standards, and that really stymies the developments of animals that could use marginal lands.
And potentially also animals that might be healthier for us to eat, because feeding them endlessly on soy.
Absolutely, they have all the complex omega-3s and all those things that we'd all be better off eating a lot more of. Yeah.
And possibly less fatty because they're not all fed on corn-fed
Well, good,
chicken.
I mean, it's good fat in the sense that it's rich with omega-3, etc.
Some further interesting thoughts. I'm now going to move on to Zach Polanski, who's going to ask some more questions about community food grain.
Yeah, I'm going to avoid the conversation about eating animals and also avoid the conversation you'll be pleased about City Airport, which we could also close metropolitan open land, and just imagine what we could do with that space. Anyway, Brian, you partly started on this already with OrganicLea, talking about what your role is in the community. Could I broaden you out more widely? So what is the role of community in urban farming?
So I think our market garden site is a farm. It's not a community garden. Our community gardening activity is training people at our site. We're a horticulture training centre, and we've got lots of examples that people can look at and get involved in practically, and then supporting them to go out and find other bits of land in Waltham Forest and surrounding boroughs that they do want to kind of cultivate as a community, to grow some of their own food or grow some food for the community, give it to food banks or whatever they might want to do, but also just to hone their skills and to create a social activity and create a social space for people to come together. And I think when we're talking about how do we get some of these messages across and change the culture around food, these spaces are really important. And I think when you think about capital growth and the amount of sites around London that essentially provide this service, you've basically got this network of community infrastructure that exists all around London that needs to be seen for what it is in terms of the value that it offers. So I guess we're in our kind of quite fairly complex business model, but it makes sense, is that we do grow food in our market garden, but we also have a really strong presence and focus on supporting other people in other spaces in our community to kind of, in a way, to create that local food system. We're not interested in just operating ourselves. Essentially what we're trying to do is transform the local food system into something that is sustainable and resilient. And there are well-proven ways of doing that, and I think it's just about how do you replicate that, not exactly, but that according to local sort of situations. So essentially you just use the resources that are already there, including land, but also people.
I went to visit the team at Incredible Edible, and they talked about the physical experience of young people in particular putting their hands in the soil and having that kind of educational experience to be thinking about nature, the environment and food. How important is that as part of your work, that kind of educational awareness?
It's really important, and we always come, from our point of view, we come to it from a food growing perspective, but essentially just people entering into a green space, it changes them. And you talk to people many years later and they just remember that moment where they came through our gate and they had a feeling of something. And that's the same for staff that have started working for us as well. So I think it's, again, from our point of view, it's about creating that connection around food and nature and community, and none of it should be separated. But that's what's happened. Everyone's kind of got quite disengaged from both nature and food. And it's about kind of addressing that and changing the direction.
Thank you. And what would you say are the key barriers to more community growing initiatives? What's stopping them happening?
For community growing, rather than farming,
or both would be interesting.
So on the farming side, I think we've talked about it, but I think it's access to land. But that land, when we're talking about marginal land, I think the opportunity around London is, well, you've got all this land that isn't really that productive in many ways, and the big gap is horticulture, because that's where you get the biggest wins in terms of employment opportunities, but also nutrition, and it's also where we are importing most of our food. The biggest gap in terms of our food supply is that we don't produce enough of our own fruit and vegetables. And then you've obviously got carbon wins there as well, because if people eat more fruit and vegetables, then that should displace the amount of higher carbon foods, meat and dairy as well. So I think there's a huge opportunity to do that and find the land to do that. You've then obviously got a skills issue, because you need the people to go, and if you find lots of land next week, we're not necessarily going to have all the people who can go and cultivate on it and do it effectively as a sort of viable businesses. So there's a sort of parallel process that needs to be developed and sort of rolled out, finding land, but also making sure there's people ready to go onto that land at the same time. And you've kind of got to get the timing right, because it's totally unfair to train people up to do this stuff and then have nothing for them to do. So there needs to be a sort of like a well thought through approach to it. In terms of community growing, I guess you're looking at smaller spaces generally, because that's what exists. But in a way, any space can be utilised as community growing. So, in some way, the space issues, how those spaces become available. We often meet people who want to do something on a bit of land and they don't know what to do. It's the housing association, so it's kind of breaking down those barriers that aren't really insurmountable, but it's just having easier ways to do it. And then I think there's an element of actually getting people to realise that those spaces are theirs to go and do something in, rather than feeling that their space is where there is inside their front door, and maybe if they've got a garden or a balcony and that's it. It's actually thinking much more about almost where's the kind of community spaces, the commons that can be reclaimed, so that social interaction can happen.
It leads me to my last question, which is that there's often a lack of diversity, particularly from marginalised groups, in these kind of community projects or more generally. What do you think can be done to break down some of those barriers and make sure that essentially food security and growing food, farming food, is for everyone?
I guess it's about having supporting people to take on leadership roles from those communities that can then either to be an example or actively support others from their communities to get involved. I think also maybe it's just that idea of not understanding that space should be theirs, and or that they should feel like they can go and do something there. That there's kind of, I guess, the experience of being marginalised means it's harder for you to then come and engage in activity in your community. So I think, in a way, there's more fundamental issues there rather than just for, I guess, the food grain sector. It's actually thinking about, more kind of.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Brian.
Just some boroughs, in Lewisham as an example, published guidance on how you could access land, and they made it very public and they provided support. Other boroughs have done it. Also, with the Capital Growth Project, there was a project that got a lead in each local authority to support kind of capital growth projects, and that is also kind of used to be, I think, is still reported on the Good Food for London report. My experience is that with the community development approach, and it depends on who the lead organisation will be or the enabler, that you can get real diversity involved in taking land once people know that they can. So it's that kind of communication about, as Brian's just said, and then my experience is that people are willing to get engaged. And I just wanted to add just a recent experience that we've got. I've got a project in Woolwich Common. It's quite it's got a real high instance of antisocial behaviour and violence, and so we've started a project funded by Safer Communities to address, kind of make a safer community. And the community are leading on it, creating community gardens, edible, all over the estate as a response to feeling like they want to be in a cleaner, nicer. So it started with rubbish and antisocial behaviour, and it's turning into transforming an estate into an edible estate, led by the residents, but through a partnership of kind of empowering people that they could improve their own environment. And I think there can be different anchors, but sometimes it's safer communities, sometimes it could be public health, but there are different ways to do it. And I think we need to make the most of those opportunities, but I think we need to have some leadership at the borough level, and I think we need that information for people to know that they have that right. And a lot of that is especially housing land. But
okay. Sorry, go on, Sarah.
I was just going to say, I mean, obviously that's the benefit that you've got of, like, Capital Growth has got this overview of what's going on, and actually what we've seen since the pandemic is local authority, public health in particular, waking up and going, oh my goodness, we've got this amazing potential. You know, people have been beavering away for years doing it, and some public health departments are all over it already. So we're seeing a little bit of a resurgence in some areas where they did great stuff and then had stopped, like Camden, and now they've got a whole food growing strategy going on. I mean, Waltham Forest, obviously, because they've got OrganicLea, have got sort of an overview of what's going on. So I think we are seeing a little bit of a resurgence at a borough level. Places like Southwark have actually created a process. I think this is what saying, like, you have permission to go and access this land as long as you meet this criteria. So they've set that up around housing estates. So if you've got 5 people and you've spotted a bit of land, you can literally go and apply, and then you get a small grant and the support that you need to start your food growing space. So I think there's a real, like, resurgence. You know, we're ahead of the game in many ways in London anyway, but I think there's even more opportunity to join up those dots. We've got lots of local networks as well that exist within boroughs that are helping that happen. So we've got Incredible Weddell Lambeth, Incredible Weddell Barnet, places in Tower Hamlets. What we need to do is work so that all boroughs have got that sort of support network, and that's one of the things that we're doing, is sort of trying to target some of those other places. So we've been hanging out in West London, where there's much less of that, and also supporting some of the emerging networks that are there for Black and people of colour-led organisations, and trying to support sort of what is it that they're looking for and how can we support them to access the funding that they need. I think Impacts on Urban Health have recently done a Black Business Fund, which obviously that's about business, but there's a sort of real interesting approach to targeting people with a particular fund that says, like, this is for you, this is you know, your access into this space. So we've been trying to do a lot of work around that, around diversifying the existing gardens, but also creating new spaces that are led by different people.
Can I just ask very briefly, because I sense the chair will want me to move on. But we had Talia Chain came to the committee when I was chair, who runs a Jewish farm. She talked about Muslim farms being run. Would you think it would be a good idea for the mayor to be proactively, I hear some of this is happening with the borough and this is happening with the fund, but to be proactively looking for these leaders within marginalised communities to actually make them more aware that these funds are there?
Yeah, no, completely. I mean, I think that will go a long way to sort of recognising the work that people are trying to do and championing within their local community. So, you know, for example, you've got the Black Farmers Market as well, which is, you know, could again a really great opportunity to build out from that to growing spaces. So yeah, great.
Thanks. And Brian, finally.
Just so, I guess to echo what Claire was saying earlier, a real opportunity here is around adult learning as well, in terms of how to support people from sort of marginalised communities to come into this space. A kind of structured learning programme is often an easier way to access it rather than understanding how the system works and trying to figure that one out. And also, particularly so through food growing, but also food cooking, you can create very practical approaches which also support people who have been marginalised from the education system. So it's not a sort of formal learning. You can deliver these courses in very practical ways about skills and building their confidence. And I would suggest that's a kind of a quick win to sort of how you can start to address some of these inequalities.
Thank you. We're going to move on now to Assemblymember Devonish, but can I just remind everybody that we've only got half an hour left and we've still got some ground to cover, because I want to finish at 5, because we don't normally go on for longer than that. So coming over to you now. I'm sorry?
Was there one for Hina? Was Hina coming in?
No, we're not. We're moving straight on to Assemblymember Devonish, who's going to pick up some questions about allotments.
I'll be very brief, Chair. Good afternoon again, everybody. To the GLA and LFB, and again, please don't feel you all have to answer these questions. Just maybe one person with short answers. Has the percentage of land in London that is used for allotment gardens changed during the 8-year tenure of the current mayor? Has it gone up? Has it gone down? If not, why not? Who wants to take that?
I don't think we know, but you might know. Local authorities obviously manage them.
You could write to us otherwise.
I think that, I mean, unfortunately, I think that we will have lost some allotment sites over that time. I think I've got a stat of around 40 allotment sites. Some of those allotment sites are privately owned rather than sort of local authority owned allotment sites. So I don't know if you're aware of the case with the Duke of Northumberland over in, is it Northumberland? Anyway, I get my dukes muddled up. But, you know, 3 times now that's gone back to planning because, you know, he's desperate to, you know, he really wants to build affordable housing for the people of West London at the expense of the allotments. So, you know, yeah, there is a threat to allotments. At the same time, we know, and the waiting lists are really high. Local authorities are doing their best to manage them. I think they were always just like, oh God, you can sort it. You know, it was one of those. But now, for example, in Malvern Forest, they really see the opportunity with their allotments, and they're doing lots of you know, innovative stuff about plot sharing and communal plots on allotments. But ultimately, not everyone can have access to an allotment in London. So that's where the community growing comes into it. But I think, you know, allotments are a really, you know, we talk about diversity. If you go, I've got an allotment, and, you know, it's a really diverse multicultural place with, you know, brimming with sort of interesting people, a bit of tension, and you know, just plays out all of that stuff. So I think they're great, and it's important that we continue to protect them, but they're only part of the story.
Great. Maybe you can just write to us a bit more detail, because the second part of my question is the percentage of land used for allotment gardens has been indicated within the London Food Strategy Implementation Plan since 2018. This data is currently not available on the London Data Store. And perhaps you can write to me. I won't ask you when you know if it's going to be published. I doubt you do. But if you could write to me when you think it will be published, that would be fantastic. And if there are any reasons for delay in publishing it, if you could write to me on that, again, I'd be grateful. And I come to my next question, which is, there is limited data on the number of allotments in London, with much data being sourced from FOI requests from councils. Has the GLA considered collating a century repository data of food growing in London? Brief answer on that?
I mean, we're sort of de facto that for the non-allotment sites in terms of community grown, but I mean, I have to be honest, with the amount of resource that we get at the moment, that's almost a job in itself.
Yeah.
Because just keeping up to date with, we've got a database of 4,000 gardens. We know not all of those are active. We think that around 1,500 are, but just, you know, we've got a part-time post that runs Capital Growth. Sure. So I think in order to get accurate data, you need to invest in getting that. It would be great if we could get we could have a bit of a splurge and try and do that.
You've answered my next question, which is what are the barriers and basically resources. So then I move on to across London there appears to be many different approaches to allotments, including significant differences in cost and availability between the boroughs. What more can be done to make food growing easier for Londoners? Anything else to add to that?
I mean, I think it's just, you know, there isn't, you know, there's not statutory allotments in every borough. We can't sort of start from scratch. We have to work with what we've got. But there's, you know, that's the beauty of community growing is there's a sort of there's a set of ways that we can do it. I think expecting, you know, having some sort of expectation of local authorities that they've thought about this either in a food strategy plan or whatever is really good. In Scotland, they've done this there where everyone has to have a food growing strand as part of their Community Empowerment Act. I'm not suggesting we'd want to be as top down as that. I think that idea of a principle that all local authorities think about the provision that they offer. We know it's really important that people have access to green space within the sort of short distance of where they live, and that isn't always equal. Food growing adds that additional benefit, I suppose, of, you know, keeping you healthy, keeping you more physically active. So, you know, it's real win-win for local authorities to do it. I think they just sometimes need a bit of a gentle encouragement too.
I'll ask my next question because I think Claire wanted to come in, but I'll ask my next question. You can come in on both, Claire. What potential is there to take advantage of the unused land to convert into food-growing areas? I think this is slightly touched on earlier, such as Hounslow Council's Growth for the Future programme, please.
Yeah, no, I think there's huge potential. I echo everything that Sarah said. I do think we need support at a local authority level because that just makes it so much easier to access it. Grants are great, but as Brian said, we've got the adult learning budget. I can't say it anymore. We've got the public health budget. I've got, you know, I'm using Safer Communities funding for one of my projects. There are so many different ways it can be supported because the benefits are so broad, you know, so, and economic benefits. So I think there's huge opportunity. I just think we need support around it. And I think Capital Growth could do with more support, but I think we need boroughs to take this on.
And have you shared the Hounslow case study with other boroughs, and do you have other similar initiatives?
So Hounslow presented at the boroughs subgroup, so it's then shared with the London Food Board. So we do, and we have exemplar projects presenting at all of the boroughs' food groups.
And we've also got an inter-council network for food growing that Capital Growth runs, so we get and that's growing and building. So we have about 18 councils represented, and hopefully over the next year we'll get all of them there.
And one other thing I was just going to say, which is complementary, and I know we've said it a few times, is the food partnerships, the sustainable food places that we didn't mention, but 2 resilience reports said how they improve resilience of towns, particularly during COVID. And the Food Routes 2 is supporting the development of food partnerships, and we recommend sustainable food places, and food growing is listed in there, and it gives a really good framework for a local area to adopt the things that provide and so everything's connected, and food growing is always in there.
Absolutely. And my final question, what role does energy prices have on the financial viability of urban farming, including those growing inside in artificial conditions? Obviously it doesn't help when prices go up is the answer to that question.
I mean, if any of you know the huge swathes of glass houses that are down in Hertfordshire and Broxbourne and stuff, I mean, you know, energy prices went up and they all just had to pack up. And I think at one stage they were producing like 1 in 4 salads in the whole country. So I think this is what we're talking about when we're talking about resilience. You know, it's got to be future-proof to those shocks and those changes. You know, even though it's not necessarily the sort of growing that we see, it's a real loss to see that. And now they're looking at turning those into that area into housing, right? So, we've just got to be mindful of the sort of future-proofing of those.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, to echo that point, it has had a big impact on what we'd call the intensive horticulture sector, and one of the odd things we learnt over the last sort of 18 months was that some types of growing, so Kew Gardens, for example, qualify for the energy support schemes, whereas horticulture businesses didn't. And when it comes to food production and food supply, we thought that was a little bit of a weird omission, but we've made a case to Treasury. It'd be great if anybody else wanted to make that case as well for energy support for food production.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
That was incredibly efficient. Thank you very much. And that's such a disappointment to hear that the Lee Valley, which is designated a regional park trust, and which is where all these glass houses were situated, is now possibly going to be going down that road. But I am going to pass swiftly on to Assemblymember Joanne McCartney, who's now going to pick up some further questions.
I am, and can I start with Sarah and then Mark, if I can? And Sarah, you touched on this in response to my colleague Onka Sahota's questions, but it's about the capital growth network and community growing. Just really looking, are there enough resources and funding given to it? What is the future, and how can we further support it?
We're sort of... how do I answer this question without saying, yes, just give us some more money? But it's that opportunity loss, I suppose, is that we're not doing all of the things that we could be doing. We're not tying together all of these agendas. We're sort of just ticking by, giving as much support as we can to all of the new emerging gardens, the gardens that are hitting difficult times, the boroughs and the networks that need it. So we're okay. We're just hanging on in there. We get a grant from the City Bridge Foundation, which runs out actually at the end of June, and we need to resubmit and hopefully get two more years of funding, which we'll need to match. So that there is a resource issue there. What has changed is there are a lot more local established networks that are finding their own funding, often again through the City Bridge Foundation. They're doing tons in that area, so it's really within their remit. So there are grant programs that come out for the GLA that help individual gardens. Often they're the bigger ones. I think there's something about the really small seed funding for small groups to sort of get going that's really, really helpful. When we were giving out our grants back in the day, they were like £1,000, and sometimes they even struggle to spend that, especially if they're volunteer run. Then you've got the next level up, which are the gardens that have a paid person that's running them, that can then do the supported activities, the things like the social prescribing, the education and the skills work. So there's sort of lots of different levels in there. But yeah, we would like to be doing much more and to be a bit more strategic in how we're delivering that, and to be able to really complement the work of the food strategy through some additional resources. As I say, having a part-time member of staff doing all of this work is quite a stretch at the moment. So yeah, it's either with us or just overall having someone with a remit for that London-wide coordination of our gardens. It really pays dividends to do that work, and to have that infrastructure, because there's always someone to come and basically I'm always there, or my colleagues are always there to ask for these numbers, for these stats, for these opportunities, for these case studies, for the examples. So yeah, I would say we're missing opportunities if we don't invest a little bit more time and energy in getting all the boroughs up to the same level.
Good. And Mark, if you have anything to add to that at all?
Well, no, I think it's a comprehensive and brilliant answer, really. One reflection I would offer is that obviously for good reason, the focus of capital growth has changed over time, as Sarah alluded to earlier. You could easily argue that it's more important now and it's more effective now, albeit in different ways to its historic role, than it ever has been. And its reputation precedes it, it's world-renowned, and it's needed more than ever. Now, I'm not responsible for the budgetary decisions around that programme. And as Sarah said before, it got moved into the health team when immediately post-COVID. And now it's in the children and young people's team, actually. Yeah. So those are where the decisions are made. But I think it's better now, and it's more important now than ever it has been.
Okay, thank you. And then can I ask Brian, if I can, about your Market Garden City project that has had money from the Mayor's Good Growth Fund to improve facilities in Hawkwood Nursery in Chingford and Wolves Lane Nursery in Wood Green, which I know because it's just down the road from me. Can I just ask what the progress has been and what impact it has had on your plans and future ambitions?
Progress has been slow for various reasons, pandemic included. and then cost increases, and then having to then find more money, and with match funding from the lottery as well. And so there's been lots and lots of complications, and it's been not necessarily, I haven't been so involved in it, but some of my colleagues have spent a lot more time than we ever expected to do on this. But anyway, here we are. Where we've ended up is actually the Wolves Lane site, for technical reasons about the match funding, was where most of the good growth money then ended up being invested in. Those buildings are pretty much on their way. I mean, they'll be opened this summer, I think. And so that site essentially will start to look like the architectural plans that were put forward 4 or 5 years ago, and it will start to become real for everyone. So it's been a bit torturous, but we're going to get there, and then it's going to be an amazing resource for that site. From Hawkwood's point of view, and our Chinkford site, we had to say, actually, we'll let the money go to Wolves Lane because it was more important to keep the project going there. We're more established and it wasn't so necessary. And we've got some of the money which we're going to invest in some small kind of improvements, mostly about improving our kind of environmental performance. I guess the concept, so when we put forward for the project for the funding, for the good growth funding, we were just looking at the site that we've got at Hawkwood and then the potential for the site at Wolves Lane. They're both local authority plant nurseries, and also aware of there's other examples over in Dagenham with growing communities, and there's 1 or 2 others where those sort of facilities have been put to amazing use, been basically turned over to the community by the local authority, and then sort of like brought back into use and flourishing, and incredible sort of outputs coming for the community. So I guess as we were starting to think about those 2 sites, so well, okay, this could just be the start of something bigger. So we kind of put it forward within the framework of this concept, and also thinking about the GLA. Well, maybe if they want to latch onto this concept, it wouldn't be a bad thing. It would dovetail very nicely with the what's the one that does exist, National Park City. So yeah, it's, I guess the question is, like, we've done our bit at our 2 sites. Now it's for others to think about how it could happen elsewhere, and obviously we're happy to we'd like to be part of that, supporting that. There's an interesting site in Redbridge, which we're supporting some local people to see with the council how they can explore bringing that back into use. It's quite derelict, so it's quite a lot of work. There's an amazing site in West Ham Park, which is Corporation of London, which has sat empty for 10 years, and it's perfectly fine. We could go in there next week and start growing in it, and it's just crazy that... So
it doesn't need remediation at all? No.
No. No.
And our fringe farming work was sort of trying to complement some of the work that was started there. But, you know, as I was explaining about the example of Enfield, and it's not just Enfield, so we're not picking on Enfield, it's much more difficult to get local authorities infused by this idea. Well, it was at that time, and unfortunately that fringe farming workers, but, we'd be up for somewhat, I think, having some presence within the GLA from the Met, a flagship sort of flag waving, this, we really want to make this happen, is sort of what's needed to really rally the local authorities and the people that have got access to the land and the resources that we need to make that happen. So there's a real flagship project opportunity there, but they're busy trying to get the price of building materials sorted to actually build the stuff. It needs a joined up approach to that, I'd say.
Thank you. And I think, Brad, I'm right in saying that with the education piece, you're going to do exactly what Sheila was talking about, not only about food growing, but cooking classes and so forth for the wider community.
Yeah, we do some of that already, but we've actually got plans to be more explicit about it, linked to a City Bridge funded project around reducing people's the food and carbon, making that linkage, and actually trying to get people to eat more fruit and veg by learning how to cook it better.
Good. And my last question then in this section is to
Tony just wants to come in.
Oh, do you want to come in, Tony, on that one point?
Tony wants to come in very briefly just on this
Just
area.
to say, have you actually asked the Corporation of London for access to this site in West Ham? And if you haven't, I would suggest you get the Deputy Mayor, Jules Pipe, to write to Chris Hayward of the Corporation, and you can blame me. But I do think he's trying to move things forward, like, you know, so if it's been derelict for 10 years, why, you know?
I've asked some people in the Corporation of London, and they've struggled to figure out how to do it. But I think it's earmarked for housing. So I've talked to Newham Council, and they say they can't really do anything. So.
So we've can I answer the question? Yeah. So we've recently, what do you call it, revived conversations with the Corporation's Director of Markets, and we were talking about the wholesale markets moving to Barking and all that stuff, but I'll ask him in the next few days about that West Ham site and what the possibilities are.
Okay, thanks for that, Tony. I'm going to come back to Joanne for her last question that she was about to ask.
It's just a Sheila, and I think you've sort of answered this already, but are there any lessons that can be learnt from elsewhere in the UK about how we can improve growing opportunities in London? You've already given some examples, but is there anything else that comes to mind? Or obviously you can always contact us afterwards.
Well, somebody has already mentioned edible. Yeah, what is it called? Yeah. Edible. I'm sorry, my brain is going. Yeah. I often feel that that there just isn't enough. Well, I mean, it's clear to me today that that there is a lot of joining up in London, but there aren't enough. There isn't enough joining up being done nationally, and I don't know who does that. I mean, somebody mentioned the University of Sheffield study about what's going on there about growing. There, and that's, I mean, I met the coordinator of that, what is it called? The sustainable food places. I mean, sustainable food places seem to me a real resource about the best of what is happening all over Britain. I mean, lots of the people who've won awards for the BBC Food and Farming Awards, like My Cow Molly in Sheffield, that was a dairy farm that was just going, was just going nowhere because they were selling into the commodity market, and decided that they would invest some money in pasteurization and make a virtue of the fact that they were right on the edge of Sheffield, and have a contract with the university and market to all the hundreds of coffee shops that actually fresh milk made a hell of a sight better coffee than this stuff that was coming in days and days, possibly weeks old. That there are these entrepreneurial farmers and growers. I'm sure Nick knows hundreds of them, but the weight of the establishment food, the weight of supermarkets, the weight of habits that we have formed around supermarkets is kind of deadening. And I know I keep saying supermarkets, but supermarkets are. I mean, they're a burden on farmers right now, and they mess up our possibilities of us eating better. I mean, I know they have great virtues, but I think we have to think much more about escaping their grasp. That's not terribly helpful.
If it's just one other suggestion and request is about the anchor institutions. So we're talking a lot about the local authorities, but it's the hospitals, the prisons and the universities. And if I look at Greenwich and Oxley's, and they have all the metropolitan open land, we have a huge number of prisons in Greenwich. One of them is full of glass houses, which is a training opportunity. And currently they are making healthy frozen ready meals for me that I take over to vulnerable people all over Greenwich. But they have huge resources. They have a kind of a complementary agenda, and I think in London we need to be considering them as part of this as well. to complement the work that we're doing. And I just think those anchor institutions, and particularly when they're in a borough that's also looking at local wealth building, it can be very complementary because they're already part of that conversation.
The NHS and all the meals they produce as well. Yeah.
I was going to say it maybe doesn't sound that exciting, but I think there is an opportunity to take a bit of a strategic approach around like where is it we think the real opportunities are, and what's the big vision for where we could be, like rather than doing what we're doing at the moment with food grain, which is a bit year on year. It's like, what do we want? We had that big vision when we did the Capital Growth initial campaign, and it was amazing. The city came to life and people visited, and there was all sorts of entrepreneurial and community entrepreneurs as well that are really creating change. And I think we need that next vision, and we need to come together on it. And I think so. It's partly about getting the plan in place for what we want, but then giving local people the opportunity to have really great, fascinating ideas. And I think London's absolutely brimming and full of that. What they don't want to get bogged down is like, how do I access the land? Oh God, I've spoken to 10 people in the local authority. Oh, someone's told me I need my soil. We just need to take away all of that headache for them, which we can do, and leave them to do the creative engagement side of it. And I think that that's where we could be. We're already looked at by other bits of the world. We've had the opportunity to go and talk to other bits of the world about what we do. We could still do some really great stuff. And so, for example, in Hull, they've just passed this right to grow. We don't quite know, that's an incredible edible initiative, but it's the idea is like, you shouldn't have to ask for permission. The landowner should be telling you why you can't do it. So it's sort of changing around that way of thinking about land. And I also sort of internationally, places like New York have got much...
Coming on to that in a
right, okay,
so I'm going to stop you there if I can.
But I mean, I think we're doing pretty well in London, but at the moment it sort of just needs a little bit of that, creating that infrastructure so that we can let the community, initiators get on and do that stuff while we're helping them get the land and the training and the support that they need.
Thank you.
Okay, so which does bring us on to our very last questions, which is looking at the international comparators. And I'm going to start with Nick and give Sheila and then Sarah, who I'm going to pass her afterwards. What lessons could London learn from elsewhere abroad? I mean, Sheila's talking about the supermarkets and the way we structure our stuff in this country. Just over the channel, France, an entirely different ecosystem for growing foods, distributing food, how everybody does it there. Anywhere else, I'm just mentioning France because it's very close.
I mean, as we discussed a moment ago, though, maybe food producers in France aren't all that happy with how things are going over there.
I'm not saying it's perfect.
Either. It is a different system, and I think we keep coming back to this. Obviously, the role of the supermarkets is crucial. I mean, I would say that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we're approaching 70 million people in this country, and a huge amount who are in this city. It is, whatever happens, it's going to be an incredibly complicated task to make sure that they've got 3 meals a day, and they might be shopping every day for food, and so you're going to have a fairly sophisticated supply chain to meet that demand. And so I do think supermarkets have an important role to play, and by and large they achieve an objective of keeping people fed and those food supply chains flowing for that enormous amount of people. The problem is they're doing it in an economically unsustainable way, in as much as the food producers at the one end of that chain, as I said earlier, not necessarily getting a fair reward. And what does that, ultimately, what are the solutions to that? You can basically say people have got to pay more for food, pay the real cost of food, which is as politicians, I'm sure you'll appreciate, that's a very difficult argument to run. Or there's got to be more government support for farmers to be sustainable and produce the food that's needed and remain viable. Now, at the moment, talking about the international comparisons, we have taken a sort of step, I think a wrong step away from building a system that might do that. So on the one hand, we're not really providing any support at all in a whole load of ways for food production, whether that's support with things like energy prices, whether that's support for labour costs, whether that's direct support for food production, which is being phased out in England, whereas in most countries in the world there is still some sort of support system, I mean a sort of farm payment system or similar, that has a food production element to it. Now, there are risks to that because you have to make sure that any system keeps the environment in mind, sustainability in mind as well. But actually, arguably, the route we're going down at the moment doesn't do that. And at the same time, we're opening up our markets to foreign competitors in a highly liberalising way. So what we're really doing is saying, UK food producers, you produce to higher and higher standards, and by the way, can you keep going toe-to-toe and competing increasingly with other producers across the world who don't meet those standards? There's a whole load of other issues that come to that in terms of what was discussed earlier in terms of exporting our carbon footprint and the like, but to come back to that question, yes, there's a lot we can learn from all sorts of countries because we are going down a route which basically nobody else has, or very few other countries have gone down in terms of not really providing a support scheme or support system that properly focuses on food production. I mean, I'm very happy to write to the committee and send them reams of more thoughts about that.
We'd be very happy to take any further thoughts because obviously we are very pressed for time now. I said I wanted to come to Sarah and then to Sheila.
I don't know what I can add to what Nick said. I mean, we have an election coming up, and
several.
That government will be landed with these trade deals. I don't know what they've put us in this terrible position of demanding of farmers and growers here to meet these standards, and then these trade deals, which, we're supposed to compete with this. And, I mean, I know the virtues of supermarkets. Supermarkets, have kept people fed, and they've introduced all kinds of, interesting food complexities into our lives. But they have way, way, way too much power over. And what it seems to me, the Assembly, what this can do, for a city the size of London, is to, as we've all said before, and Sarah and Claire have spelled out, is show different models to support local food networks, make it easier to get food in other ways. I don't know what else a city like London can do. I mean, you can learn from Copenhagen how you deal with obesity. You can, there are, and the way that French supermarkets run. But what you can do is go ahead with those models that we've talked about today.
So model it, actually make it happen. Okay.
Yeah.
And Sarah, we've looked at some details of what's being done by the City of London, but not here in Canada, which isn't far from Toronto. And they've got a strategy which includes urban foodscaping, which is about making food production much more visible around the City of London. Do you think that would work here? It's about creating that sort of greater visibility. How do we get the issue of food security, food resilience, nutritious food into the public domain much more?
That's what Incredible Edible Todmorden were the sort of exemplars of, is that, and they didn't seek permission, they sought forgiveness sort of type thing. They just did it. They just planted everywhere, and they call it, planting propaganda. Their propaganda is their sweet corn out the front of the police station and all that sort of stuff. So that there are examples of that. We've worked we've tried to work really closely with local authorities to get their parks departments to understand that. But there's people say things like, but what if people pick them? And we're like,
well, that would be shocking.
Yeah, well, how shocking. But yeah, so I think that there is a whole sort of education around sort of urban design and landscape design about building in edible planting schemes. I think that happens a lot more. The whole thing about the tree planting strategies, where we're like, yeah, great, bring it on, fruit and nut trees. Like, why can't we have more of those in the city? So yeah, there are definitely ways to raise it in public consciousness and to bring that in. We've got an amazing network of community gardens. Often they're a little bit hidden. So we probably do need more of those education, but there are quite a few in parks. But yeah, I think sort of just that putting it out there and celebrating it is. And I think so. I get sometimes frustrated with the quirky projects like the one on the bus stop and the skip garden, because it's like great, but they're the ones that sort of attract all the money. But they are really important. As we've said, we're up against marketing agencies doing telling us all the time about the sort of the other sorts of food that we should be eating. So I think celebrating that is a really important part of it.
I certainly think one of the benefits of the free school meals, which we have talked about, has been that a number of the schools have then also installed gardens where they've got the children growing things, and the children actually can see that the things that come out of the garden are then actually being incorporated into their meals that they're eating, and not just in terms of herbs being scattered over salad, but also growing salads and carrots and so on and so forth. So I think that visibility point is very well made, and I think that's really helped engage children with actually where food comes from, which I think several people have touched on. Sadly, I think we are going to have to call this session to a close because it is 3 minutes past 5, so I've failed in my task of keeping us all to time, and I can see that Assembly members are keen to go. I'd really like to thank the guests for coming. I hope you've enjoyed listening to each other as much as we've enjoyed and found your contributions valuable. We have a couple more bits of business to deal with, which will be very quick, but if you feel that you need to start putting your bags together and going, we will not be offended. Could I ask the committee to note the report that we received and the discussion that we've just held?
Noted.
And could I ask the committee to delegate authority to me and in consultation with the party group lead members to agree any outputs arising from this discussion that we've had today? Thank you. Our Environment Committee work programme, which is now quite short because we've only got one meeting left, could I ask you to note the work programme for the rest of the year? The date of the next meeting is going to be with the Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy on the 6th of March at 2 p.m. in this very place. There's no other business that I consider to be urgent. I declare this meeting closed. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.